Chapter 320. For women, age was a taboo after the age of 18. Suhi actually did not have this problem. She was 18 when she died. From then on, her life would forever be fixed at 18 years old. From a certain point of view, even after 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years, she would still be 18. In Yangqiu County, in the old mansion in the county, Li Mu and Suhi ate the hot pot that she had been longing for a long time. Suhi did not directly promise him that she would go to Luoyang with him in 3 months, but she did not reject him either. She felt guilty for her late parents and wanted to stay here to watch over their graves for a month. For the past 20 years, Suhi had been trapped in the Gulf of Clearwater. What she had experienced the most, besides hatred, was loneliness. In the past, she had often blamed Li Mu for not accompanying her. Li Mu had simply released 2 female ghosts, one big and one small, to accompany her. Suhi was obviously bored out of her wits. Li Mu ate hot pot with her 3 times in 2 days. On the 3rd day, Mr. Mei and Shangguan Li arrived at Yangqiu County. The left assistant minister of the Ministry of War came with them. He was under the Empress' orders to escort Shangguan Li and the others back to the divine capital. Most of the 6th realm cultivators in the imperial court were senior officials. The Empress' inner guard had only been established for a short period of time, so there weren't any cultivators above the 6th realm. However, the imperial court had the consecration department, which had many independent cultivators recruited by the imperial court. But this operation was top secret. For safety reasons, the Empress still sent the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War. The Ministry of War and White Deer Institute had always been neutral. They didn't involve themselves in the imperial court. The generals guarded the borders of the Great Zhou. Even if there was a change of regime in the Great Zhou, they wouldn't withdraw their troops. The officials of the Ministry of War were loyal to the current ruler. This time, when they went to Yingzhou to investigate, they passed by Yunzhong County and met Madame Chu, who was looking for Shangguan Li and the others. This was the first time that Suhi and Mrs. Chu had met. Li Mu was a little worried that they would have a conflict, so he secretly looked in their direction a few times. Seeing that they didn't seem to have any intention of fighting, he gradually relaxed. In the corner of the courtyard, Mrs. Chu looked at Suhi and said apologetically, "Miss Su, I'm sorry. At that time, I only knew that you went missing. I didn't know that you were killed by that beast, Cui Ming." Suhi shook her head slightly and said, "You were also harmed by Cui Ming. You don't have to apologize to me." Madame Chu heaved a sigh of relief and said, "I still have to thank you. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid that my soul would have dissipated long ago, and I wouldn't have had the chance to personally take revenge." Suhi was a little surprised and asked, "Why do you say that?" Madame Chu said, "Back in the northern county, in order to take revenge, I became a ghost general under Chu Jiang of Gozhouzian. Later on, I almost made a big mistake. Originally, I was going to die at the hands of Lord Cui Ming, but Lord Li learned of my old grudge with Cui Ming and spared my life. He brought me to Luoyang to find an opportunity to identify Cui Ming and take revenge on you." He glanced at Li Mu, who was not far away. Li Mu didn't tell her about these things. She only knew that Cui Ming was a spy from the demon sect and was being hunted down by the Great Zhou court. She didn't know that there were so many twists and turns before this matter. As for Cui Ming, she didn't tell Li Mu in detail. She only mentioned it twice. When Li Mu woke her up from her deep sleep, Cui Ming was already in front of her, waiting for her to personally take revenge. Obviously, although Li Mu didn't ask her, he kept this matter in mind. She looked at Madame Chu and asked, "What exactly happened in between?" Li Mu didn't look in the direction of Suhi and Madame Chu anymore. This was because Mr. Mei's stare made her feel a little uneasy. Mr. Mei looked him up and down. In the end, he couldn't help but ask, "How did you do it?" Li Mu played dumb and said, "Do what?" Mr. Mei said, "Don't play dumb with me. You're just a level 4 cultivator. How did you defeat Cui Ming, who was possessed by a level 6 cultivator?" Li Mu looked in the direction of Suhi and said, "This is all thanks to Sister Su. If she didn't possess my body, the avatar of the Lord of Illusions could crush me with one finger." Mr. Mei glanced at him and said, "Don't give me that. She's just a level 5 cultivator. Do you think it's so easy to make up for the difference of a level? Li Mu thought for a while and said, actually, after Cui Ming was possessed, his aura was just a little stronger. In reality, he wasn't that strong. With Sister Sue's mana and the Tao techniques that my master taught me, it's not strange that I defeated him. Mr. May looked at him. It was still uncertain whether Li Mu's old man master really existed. This reason wasn't very convincing, but she couldn't ask any more. At this time, the assistant minister of the Ministry of War said, "Where is Cui Ming? If we delay, there might be changes. To prevent the demon sect from leaking information, I'll search his soul first. Then, I'll immediately send a message to Luoyang to find the spy in the court." While Shangguan Li and the others were recuperating in the county office, Cui Ming, whose primordial spirit was sealed, was temporarily kept in the flask heaven space by Li Mu to avoid any accidents. As long as he was with Su He, after the two of them combined, even if the demon sect sent someone of the elder level, they wouldn't be able to bring Cui Ming back. Li Mu waved his hand and Cui Ming rolled out of the flask heaven space. When he was in Luoyang, he was still the assistant minister of the secretariat and the emperor's son-in-law. Without sufficient evidence, it wasn't easy to search his soul. Even if Cui Ming was willing, the court had to use gentle methods to search his soul. But because those methods were too gentle, the results were mediocre and couldn't guarantee the results of the soul search. There was also a violent method to search one's soul. It could forcibly read one's memories and there was no way to hide it. But this violent method caused great damage to the primordial spirit and couldn't be recovered. If this method was used on an official in the court just because of suspicion, the order of the Great Zhou court would completely collapse. But Cui Ming didn't have so many restrictions now. He was no longer a fourth-rank official, nor was he the emperor's son-in-law. He was going to die anyway. Before he died, even if he was searched into a lunatic or an idiot, no one would have any objections. The left assistant minister of the Ministry of War glanced at the unconscious Cui Ming. He reached out and pressed his hand on his head. His palm glowed with a white light. Gradually, Cui Ming's body began to twitch unconsciously. His expression was ferocious and the veins on his forehead bulged. His blood vessels wriggled like earthworms. It was obvious that he was in great pain. After a while, the left assistant minister of the Ministry of War retracted his hand and said with a solemn expression, "Among the 4 internal guards, other than the woman you captured, there are 4 others who have been bewitched by Cui Ming to become spies for the Meizong sect." Mr. May said in shock, "There are spies in the Meizong sect as well?" The left assistant minister of the Ministry of War nodded and said, "This is just Cui Ming's bewitchment. Who knows how many more spies from the demon sect are hidden in the Great Zhou court." After searching Cui Ming's soul, they only found 4 people. It wasn't a lot, but it wasn't out of Li Mu's expectations. If spies from the demon sect were discovered by the court, only death awaited them. Therefore, they kept their identities as spies a secret. In order to ensure that their identities weren't leaked, spies didn't know each other in most cases. They could only contact each other through a single line. Different spies didn't know each other's identities. This method made it so that even if the court found one spy, they couldn't follow the vine to the melon and find more spies. However, this method also had a fatal flaw. This reminded Li Mu of the infernal affairs. If the spies died, their identities would never be exposed. Not to mention the court, even the Meizong sect didn't know that they had such a spy in the court. There was a possibility that if the spy went back on his word or realized that he was promoted faster in the court, as long as he killed the spies, he could completely clear his identity and become a good citizen of the Great Zhou. He could even become an important official in the court. Of course, the benefits of a single line of communication were obvious. Even if the court caught such an important person like Cui Ming, they could only get rid of a few insignificant people in the internal guards. For the Meizong sect, it wasn't much of a loss. Mr. May said with a sullen face, "When His Majesty just ascended the throne, we were too careless when we formed the internal guards. This time, when we return to Luoyang, we must completely clean up the internal guards." She looked at Li Mu and asked, "You really don't want to go back with us?" Li Mu shook his head and said, "I've been busy for more than half a year. Let me take a break and spend time with my family. Mr. May wanted to say that His Majesty also needed someone to accompany him. He was the only one in the great show who could accompany His Majesty. However, she couldn't say it out loud. She could only say, His Majesty doesn't have many people who can be used. Try to come back as soon as possible. Li Mu nodded and said, I know. Then he glanced at the unconscious Cui Ming, who had been violently soul-searched, and asked, What should we do with him? Mrs. Chu walked over from the side and asked, Can you leave him to me? Mr. May and Shangguan Li looked at each other and nodded. Cui Ming was useless now. Bringing him back to Luoyang was also a dead end. He used to be an important official in the court and the emperor's son-in-law. If they brought him back to Luoyang to be executed, everyone would know about it. It would be a loss of face for the court. Mrs. Chu carried the unconscious Cui Ming into Li Mu's former study and closed the door. What are you doing? Don't come over. Yun, it's all my fault. I beg you to let me go. Let me go. In the room, Cui Ming's horrified voice could be heard. At first, he was still able to speak a complete sentence. Later, all that was left was a series of blood-curdling screams. Shangguan Li and Mr. May decisively sealed off their hearing. Li Mu listened to the blood-curdling screams in the room and shuddered. He didn't hesitate to shut off his hearing. After a while, Mrs. Chu walked out of the room expressionlessly. Everything in the room was the same as before. It was as if nothing had changed. However, Cui Ming, who she had just brought in, had completely disappeared. Li Mu sighed in his heart. He probably wouldn't be able to live in this house in peace in the future. It was a pity that his old house. Chapter 321. Cui Ming finally got what he deserved. What goes around comes around. Mrs. Chu died because of him, and he also died in her hands, or perhaps in her mouth. Mrs. Chu had been living for revenge for the past 20 years. Now that she had gotten her revenge, she felt a little lost. Mr. May thought for a while and asked, What do you plan to do in the future? Mrs. Chu shook her head and said, I don't know. Mr. May said, If you don't have anywhere to go, you can come back to Fairy's capital with us. If you're willing to become an internal guard, the imperial court can provide you with the resources you need for cultivation. After the spy incident was exposed this time, the internal guards suffered a great loss, especially the 5th realm Devil Sect spy. Among the internal guards without a 6th realm, he was already considered a core force. Every loss of one was a great loss to the internal guards. Mrs. Chu was strong enough and had a clean background. She was the most suitable person to recruit. Mrs. Chu was obviously hesitant. She looked at Li Mu. Li Mu said, This is your own business. You can decide for yourself. Mrs. Chu thought for a while and nodded. I'm willing. She had to thank 2 people for getting her revenge. One was Li Mu, and the other was the Empress. Li Mu didn't need her to stay by his side. She could only do something for the Empress to repay her kindness. Mr. May and Shangguan Li left under the escort of the left Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War. Li Mu lay on a stone chair in the courtyard and sighed in relief. It's finally over. He had been worried about Cui Ming's matter for several months, and now the dust had finally settled. He had gotten his revenge on Su He. He had also escaped from the Bay of Clearwater and regained his freedom. He had also reconciled with the female corpse. Li Mu had a lot of things off his mind. He felt relaxed. He lay on the stone chair. A pair of hands rested on his shoulders and gently massaged them. Left, a little to the left. Yes, here. A little to the right. Over, come back a little. Li Mu closed his eyes comfortably. Then he realized that Wan Wan and Xiao Bai were not here. Who was massaging his shoulders? He immediately opened his eyes. Su He looked at him with a smile and asked, Are you comfortable? Li Mu stood up and hurriedly said, I didn't know it was you. Just as he stood up, he was pressed down by Su He. She put her hand on Li Mu's shoulder and said, You helped me take revenge. Consider it as me repaying you. Li Mu waved his hand and said, What kind of relationship do we have? There's no need to talk about repayment. Su He asked, What's our relationship? Li Mu thought for a moment and said, You saved my life, and I saved yours. We are friends of life and death. We are not brother and sister, But we are more than brother and sister, Suhi said. Only brother and sister? When we were at the Bay of Clearwater, you called me your wife, Li Mu hurriedly explained. That was a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding. I can swear that I never had that kind of thought about you. As soon as he finished speaking, his expression changed. He grabbed her hand and said, Gentler, gentler, it hurts. Suhi picked him up and said, Stinky brother, how can an older sister serve her younger brother? It's your turn to massage me. Women really change their expressions as quickly as flipping a book. In this regard, Suhi and Lu Hanyen were no different. Li Mu stayed at the old mansion for another half a day before preparing to return to Mount Baiyun. Suhi had to stay here temporarily to watch over her parents' graves. Li Mu planned to come back and ask her about it before returning to Luoyang. After Li Mu left, Suhi stood at the door and watched his figure disappear. Her face no longer had the frivolous and lively expression she had when Li Mu was around. She sighed softly and said with melancholy, If only I was born 20 years later, how good would that be? The two ghosts, one big and one small, stood at the door. The small ghost couldn't help but ask Suhi, Sister, why didn't you tell him what was in your heart? Suhi rubbed her head and said, Humans and ghosts walk different paths. You will understand in the future. She turned and walked into the courtyard, softly humming a nameless song. When I was born, you were not born. When you were born, I was already old. When I was far from you, you were at the end of the world. When we were born at the same time, I vowed to be with you. When we were not older, how much did I feel? So close, yet so far, so hard to express my feelings. Li Mu returned to Mount Baiyun and learned that Lu Hanyen still hadn't come out of seclusion. Yuzhen Zi was only one step away from transcendence. She brought Lu Hanyen into seclusion with her, which would be of great benefit to Lu Hanyen. If she could advance to the creation realm a day earlier, Li Mu would be able to fly away with her a day earlier. Without her, Li Mu also went into seclusion on Mount Baiyun. He borrowed a Fulu encyclopedia from Hanzhe. Li Mu also knew a lot of Fulu, but it was all basic. These basic Fulu books only accounted for less than 1% of the Fulu books in the Fulu school. Apart from a few precious Fulu books, most of the Fulu books in the Fulu school were public. They weren't worried about outsiders stealing their knowledge. On the contrary, whether it was the ancestral court of Fulu school or the major branches, they all hoped that the Fulu school could be carried forward. Naturally, the more people who understood the Tao of Fulu, the better. Fulu school, Spirit Array School and Pill Cauldron School, compared to the South School, North School, and Xuanzong School, which had a longer history, were all unconventional. They blazed a new path outside of the great Tao of remarkable abilities, so they paid more attention to the inheritance of the school. Most cultivators could learn the Tao of remarkable abilities, but Fulu, alchemy, and the Tao of formations had a higher requirement of talent. Fulu and alchemy were especially difficult. Almost all cultivators could get started, but if they wanted to take a step further and become a master of talisman and pill Tao, it wouldn't be so easy. The Empress was extremely wealthy, but she could only give Li Mu normal heaven-level Fulu. In the current cultivation world, Fulu mid-level heaven-level and above could only be made by Fulu school. If he kept getting Fulu from Lu Hanyen and the Empress, he would be suspected of living off them. As a man, Li Mu's pride wouldn't allow him to keep relying on women. Now that he had enough free time, he could study the Tao of Fulu in Fulu school. In the future, he would be able to draw them himself. On White Cloud Peak, Li Mu was in seclusion studying Fulu. In the ghost region of Yudu, on a mountain peak that was forever shrouded by the curtain of night, there was an eerie palace. A black shadow that had just finished his seclusion looked at an extinguished soul lamp in the palace and roared angrily, "Who exactly killed Emperor Song? If I catch you, I will definitely extract your soul and refine it." The few ghost generals that were kneeling in the palace trembled under the pressure of this powerful aura. Chu Jiang of Gojoseon had just died for less than a year, and now Emperor Song had been murdered. In a short period of time, only 8 of the 10 kings of hell were left. In the future, they might as well call him the 8th king of hell. The black shadow rushed into the sky and quickly disappeared into the endless night sky. Country of demons, southeast, 100,000 mountains. The southeast of the demon country was adjacent to the northwest of the Great Zhou. The 100,000 mountains spanned the demon country and the Great Zhou, connecting the life continent and the Zhu continent. The country of demons wasn't like the Great Zhou, which was a unified country. The demon country was divided by demons. Within the life continent, there were no less than 100 demon countries of various sizes. The larger demon countries ruled over a region, while the smaller demon countries relied on the larger demon countries to survive. In the demon capital of a certain demon country, in the palace, an extremely handsome middle-aged man walked out of an underground secret chamber. Outside the secret chamber, everyone, including the demon king of the demon country, knelt down and said loudly, "Greetings, Heavenly Lord." The handsome middle-aged man said indifferently, "Cui Ming is dead." The men and women kneeling outside the secret chamber were all unusually handsome. One of the men said in shock, "Heavenly Lord already sent a clone to help him. How could he still die?" Could it be that the Great Zhou country sent an expert of the upper realm? The middle-aged man waved his hand, and an image appeared in the sky. In the image, there were 7 bloody holes on Cui Ming's body. It was obvious that the clone of the Heavenly Lord had taken over his body. Opposite him was a handsome young man. The young man successively executed 4 types of extremely powerful divine abilities and Dharma spells, which easily destroyed the spirit clone of the Lord of Heaven. After a short moment of silence, there was an uproar. Who is this person? How can he have such a powerful magic art? To be able to kill the clone of the Heavenly Lord so easily, he must be at the 6th realm. But how can there be such a young 6th realm cultivator? This person's magic art is too terrifying. If anyone below the 6th realm encounters him, there is only death. The scene of the Heavenly Lord's clone being killed really shocked everyone. Cui Ming, who was possessed by the Heavenly Lord's clone, had strength that was infinitely close to the 6th realm. But he was killed by this person with a series of magic arts. If it were anyone else, they would also die. In the crowd, Huan Ji looked at Li Mu in disbelief. If he had shown the strength in the image last time, she probably wouldn't have survived until today. The Heaven Lord of Illusions looked at them and asked, "Do you know who this person is?" Huan Ji walked forward and said, "Father, his name is Li Mu. He is an official of the Great Zhou. He was the one who almost captured me last time, Li Mu." The Heaven Lord of Illusions said lightly, "If we let him grow, he will definitely become a huge threat to the demon sect. Pass down my order. Anyone who can kill this person will be able to obtain a treasure personally refined by me." Everyone's eyes burned with excitement when they heard this. The Heaven Lord was at the 7th realm. If he could obtain a treasure personally refined by him, it could easily increase his strength and even give him an extra life. But when they thought of how terrifying Li Mu's magic arts were, it was as if a bucket of cold water was poured over their heads. Instantly, they didn't want to think about anything else. The Heaven Lord of Illusions looked at Huan Ji and said, "That clone was destroyed. I need to go into seclusion for a period of time. I will leave the Mirage sect and Meizong sect to you for the time being. If you encounter something important, you can discuss it with the elders." Huan Ji bowed and said, "Yes." The Heaven Lord of Illusions' body disappeared into thin air. Huan Ji raised her head and looked at everyone. She said, "Send a message to all the sections. Whoever can capture Li Mu will be heavily rewarded by the Heaven Lord." "That's right, tell them that I only want him alive, not dead." Everyone nodded and left. Huan Ji waved the 2 whips in her hands and said, "You better pray that you don't fall into my hands." Although the 10 demon sects were not a whole, there was little hostility between them. Most of the time, they cooperated. Between each sect, there was a special method of communication. In just a few days, the news of the Mirage sect and Meizong sect offering a reward for an official named Li Mu spread throughout the 10 demon sects. The reward of the Heaven Lord was extremely attractive to them. For a time, countless people began to inquire about who this Li Mu was. White Cloud Peak. In the dead of night, Li Mu sat cross-legged on his bed and sneezed a few times. He guessed that someone was thinking of him. There was only one person who would think of him in the middle of the night. The northern county was too far away from the divine capital. Ever since he left the divine capital, the Empress could no longer meet him every night through the dream invasion technique. So he picked up the spirit conch and used his magic power to activate it. He sent a message, "Your Majesty, are you asleep?" Chapter 322. Just as Li Mu had guessed, the Empress was single and didn't have a nightlife. She hadn't slept yet. Actually, when Li Mu was in Shin-du, she still had a nightlife. Her nightlife was to run into Li Mu's dreams, play chess with him, and teach him how to cultivate. After Li Mu left Shin-du, she had nothing to do at night. Li Mu felt that if the Empress were to give him the Best Minister of Great Zhou award, it could only go to him. Even when he was on vacation, he didn't forget to do things for her. He saved Shangguan Li and captured Cui Ming. After finishing his work, he still had to worry about the Empress's private affairs. He was worried that she would be lonely at night, so he even called her to ask about her. From his conversation with the Empress, Li Mu learned that many things had happened in Shin-du while he was away. The biggest one was Mr. May's purge of the internal guards. Other than a few demon sect spies who were found and executed, the internal guards had also undergone a major change. When the Empress had just ascended the throne, she had nothing but the throne. The entire imperial court was controlled by the old and new parties. The establishment of the inner guards was a way for her to cultivate her own strength. However, because the inner guards were established in a hurry, the quality of the inner guards was uneven. In the past few years, after the Empress's position was stabilized, these problems were gradually exposed. However, there weren't many internal guards to begin with. After the purge, they were obviously understaffed. After being warned by the demon sect spies, Mr. May and Shangguan Li would rather be understaffed in the future than make up the numbers. If they were infiltrated by someone with ulterior motives, it would cause even more trouble in the future. This time, if Li Mu hadn't coincidentally returned to Beijing, Shangguan Li's team would have been wiped out, and even more powerful cultivators from the court would have been killed. After talking about Shin-du, the Empress suddenly asked, "Did you teach anyone else the chant you taught me last time?" Li Mu didn't know why all the women would care about this question. They weren't Lin Daiyu, and the chant wasn't a thing. Why couldn't the chant be taught to them? In the end, Li Mu nodded and said, "Yes." The Empress was silent for a moment, then asked, "Who else?" Li Mu said honestly, "Other than your Majesty, there is also my fiancée, a little girl by her side, Xiao Bai, and a friend of mine." The Empress was silent for a while before asking, "Is that friend of yours a man or a woman? Can he be trusted?" Li Mu nodded and said, "She is a woman and one of the people this subject trusts the most. She is also the first person other than this subject to know this chant." The Empress reminded him, "Recently, I have discovered that this mnemonic chant is not as simple as it seems. It is best that you do not spread it out so easily." This was something Li Mu had told Li Qing when he taught the Clear Heart chant to her. Although the Clear Heart chant didn't have any attack power, in Li Mu's mind, it was undoubtedly the strongest support chant. If one's mind was unstable, it could be used to clear one's mind. If one was trapped in an illusion, it could be used to break the illusion. It could keep one's mind clear when one's soul was being controlled, and it could also keep one's mind clear when one was writing talismans. The former could be used to steal the sky and fake the sun, and the latter's effect was even more heaven-defying. It could increase the success rate of writing high-level fulu, and it could greatly save the time and materials needed to write talismans. In the same amount of time, the Clear Heart chant could write 10 fulu that could originally only be written once. The same materials, 9 batches would be wasted to make 1 fulu. Now, perhaps one wouldn't even need to waste a single batch. Li Mu knew better than anyone that if one had an endless supply of high-grade talismans in one's possession during a battle, then it would cause a great psychological trauma to one's opponent. It could be said that a single heart-cleansing technique would allow the Talisman Puppet sect to become the #1 sect in the Dao sects. There were too many stakes involved in this. Thus, Li Qing reminded him that it was best not to spread this mnemonic chant. Up until now, the people that Li Mu taught were all his own people. Whether it was Lu Hanyan, Wan Wan, or Xiao Bai, Li Mu hoped that they would have more trump cards to protect themselves. To him, compared to their safety, he didn't care at all which sect was the #1 Taoist sect. Lu Hanyan was his fiancée, Wan Wan was her dowry, and Xiao Bai would be with him for the rest of his life. As for Li Qing, he had an irreplaceable position in Li Mu's heart. No matter how you looked at it, only the Empress was an outsider. Li Mu thought for a moment, then said, "This mnemonic chant was passed down to me by Master. There's no need to spread it. I'll make an exception and pass it down to Her Majesty. I hope that Her Majesty won't spread it out again." In Chengdu, in Chengdu Palace, Zhou Yi's face was filled with indignation. He had passed down this mnemonic chant to so many people, and none of them were considered exceptions. Why was it that when it came to her, it was an exception? To think that she had been so good to him and rewarded him with so many things. She had even given him the precious origin pill. Whenever she encountered a good tribute, she would leave a portion for him. She had even made a life talisman for him. In the end, she was just an outsider who had made an exception? This made her feel that her sincerity had been misplaced. No more sounds came from the other side, and this made Li Mu a little vigilant. The Empress's thinking time was usually between 1 to 3 breaths. After 3 breaths, it would be an abnormal pause. What was it that caused her to pause abnormally? It was already late at night, and no one in the palace would dare to disturb her. In other words, the cause of her abnormal pause was very likely Li Mu himself. Could it be that what he had said was wrong? Li Mu's mind spun rapidly, and he immediately realized that he had made a fatal mistake. The Empress was someone who was extremely lacking in love. If he loved her, she would return it tenfold. However, if he made her feel that there was no love, the damage to her would be several times greater than that of a normal person. What he had said just now might have made her feel that she was an outsider. Li Mu's mind spun rapidly. In an instant, he thought of countless ways to apologize and explain, but they were all rejected by him in an instant. All apologies and explanations were made up after the fact. Making up after the fact would never allow a relationship to return to how it was before. Li Mu made a prompt decision and adjusted his emotions. He sighed slowly and said, "When Your Majesty heard what I said just now, did you also feel that I did not treat Your Majesty as one of my own? Did you feel that I had misplaced my sincerity?" Zhou Yi was clearly stunned. Li Mu's words directly pointed out her true thoughts. Her lips moved and she was about to speak, but Li Mu did not give her the chance. He sighed again and said, "I only said one sentence to Your Majesty, and Your Majesty already felt this way. Last time, Your Majesty was so cold to me, so heartless. Compared to what I just said, Your Majesty was 1,000 times, 10,000 times more hurtful. Your Majesty should now know how sad I was that time. Bringing up old scores and making false accusations." This was a move that Li Mu had learned from some women in his previous life. When he was at his wit's end, he suddenly had a flash of inspiration and used it without even thinking. This move was very exquisite. In a situation where he was in the wrong, by bringing up old scores and making false accusations, he could instantly turn from passive to active. For people like Lu Hanyan and Su He, who were smart, using this move naturally meant that he did not want to die quickly enough. However, against someone like the Empress, who was Xiao Bai, this was simply the best weapon. As expected, after Li Mu spoke, the Empress did not mention what had just happened. Instead, her voice was somewhat flustered as she said, "What happened last time? It was my fault. Why do you still remember?" Seeing that this move was effective, Li Mu struck while the iron was hot and said, "How could I forget? That was the greatest grievance I had suffered in my life. Even now, when I think about it, I still find it hard to calm down. Let's stop here for today. I will go to bed first." "Good night, Your Majesty." After saying that, Li Mu put down the conch and let out a long sigh of relief. Although he acted like an unreasonable and unruly girlfriend just now, it was better for the Empress to feel that Li Mu had been left out than for her to feel that she had been left out. After all, if he was wronged, it would be fine with a little coaxing. If the Empress was wronged, Li Mu would have to suffer a few lashes, and she might not even be able to forgive him. In Chengdu Palace, Zhou Yi was lying on the bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. She hesitated in her heart. Should she wait until Li Mu returned to Chengdu and simply erase this memory of him? On Baiyun Peak, there was no danger tonight. Li Mu slept on Lu Hanyan's bed and quickly fell asleep. In his dream, he met the Empress again. The Empress looked at him anxiously and said, "My dear concubine, this matter is really my fault. Listen to my explanation." Li Mu covered his ears and shook his head. "I don't want to listen, I don't want to listen, I don't want to listen." In the room, Li Mu suddenly jumped up from the bed. He covered his face and said with endless fear, "No." In the morning, Li Mu woke up early and walked around the peaks of Baiyun Peak to relax. Recently, he seemed to have some mental problems. This made Li Mu quite worried. He was a dignified man. How could he have such strange dreams? He thought about it carefully and quickly found the problem. Last night, he used the method of bringing up old scores and making false accusations to deal with the Empress. This was not a method that a man should use. He had positioned himself as the Empress's unruly boyfriend, so he should not complain about having such dreams at night. In the future, he could not treat the Empress like this. Any reasonable and normal person would not do such a thing. If this continued, this dream would probably never end. The scenery of Baiyun Peak was very beautiful. Li Mu walked around for a while, and the fear in his heart gradually dissipated. Unknowingly, he arrived at the main peak. At this time, it was time for the main peak's disciples to have their morning classes. Close to 100 disciples sat cross-legged in the square in front of the main peak's Tao Palace. They had their eyes closed and were meditating. Above their heads, a huge bell floated there. It slowly and rhythmically rang. Under the ethereal sound of the bell, all the distracting thoughts in the hearts of the disciples were washed away. In the square, the disciples cultivated quietly. In the sky above the square, cranes danced and white clouds lingered. Everything was so harmonious, but in the next instant, the sound of the Tao bell suddenly became countless times louder. Screech! A few flying cranes let out a cry and fell straight down from the sky. Under the sound of the bell, the faces of the Fulu school disciples in the square flushed red. The magic power in their bodies surged. Those with lower cultivation levels fainted directly. In front of the square, Li Mu stared blankly at the Tao bell. He immediately said, "Sorry, I've come to the wrong place. I'll leave now, I'll leave now." Chapter 323. Because of the unbelievable nightmare last night, Li Mu had been worried about his psychological problems this morning. He had completely forgotten that the ancestral court of Fulu School, on the main peak of White Cloud Mountain, had a grudge with him. Li Mu's grudge with the Tao bell was purely accidental. He did not know that the bell could sense the first Tao technique that descended into this world. Then, because of the Tao Te Ching, it overreacted and a deep crack appeared on the bell. But no matter what, the Tao bell had cracked because of him. Now, it was hiding from him whenever it saw him. Li Mu had obviously scared it. The last sound of the bell did not sound right. The red-crowned cranes flying in the sky were stunned by the sound of the bell. They fell from the sky to the square, their bodies twitching non-stop. Most of the disciples in the square also fainted from the shock. Li Mu knew that he had caused trouble. He was about to escape when the Tao bell ran faster than him. With a whoosh, it flew into the clouds and floated there, not daring to come down. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. On the main peak, several figures rushed into the sky from the various Tao palaces. Seeing the mess on the square, everyone was shocked. What happened to the red-crowned cranes? Why did so many disciples faint? Why did the Tao bell run away again? What was that sound just now? It gave me a fright. My hand even trembled. It's a pity that my Fulu painting was almost finished. The elders of the main peak floated above the square and looked at each other in confusion. Then, someone looked at the edge of the square and saw a figure preparing to escape. It's him. Why is he here? I see, so he's junior sister Lu's Tao partner. I was wondering why the bell was so scared. Li Mu originally wanted to run away, but he had been recognized so quickly. He could only turn around and bite the bullet. Well, I really didn't do it on purpose. A few elders descended from the sky. Some began to treat the twitching red-crowned cranes, while others began to wake up the unconscious disciples. An old man with a creation realm cultivation walked over and smiled at Li Mu. "It's okay. It's not the first time the Tao bell has changed. I know you didn't mean it." Buzz. In the clouds above the square, the law bell rang again, clearly venting its displeasure. Not long after, the red-crowned crane flew back into the clouds. However, it did not dare to stay on White Cloud Peak. It flew towards a distant mountain. The disciples who were knocked unconscious by the sound of the bell gradually regained consciousness. Each of them had a blank expression on their faces. "What happened? Why did I suddenly faint just now?" The Tao bell suddenly went crazy. "Look, isn't that the person who made the Tao bell go crazy last time? He's here again." Feeling the gazes of everyone in the square begin to gather on him, Li Mu knew in his heart that he shouldn't stay here for long. He cupped his hands towards the old man and said, "I'm sorry to have caused you trouble. I still have some matters to attend to, so I'll take my leave first." After saying that, he quickly walked out of the square and flew towards White Cloud Peak. Above the white clouds, the bell swayed for a moment, then slowly descended. It seemed to have sensed something, and began to circle around the spot where Li Mu had been standing. The elders were perplexed by its strange behavior. For thousands of years, the Tao bell had been very normal. Nothing had ever happened to it. Why was it that every time that person came to the main peak, it seemed to have changed into a different bell, White Cloud Peak? Li Mu returned to the small building on the peak and sat cross-legged on the bed. He swore that he would never set foot on the main peak again. Although it was the Tao bell that was afraid of him, not the other way around, this Tao bell had existed since the establishment of the ancestral court of Fu Lu School. It had been more than 1,000 years since then, and it had even developed its own intelligence. This kind of magic treasure had already surpassed the heavenly rank. It could not even be called a magic treasure anymore, but a type of monster. Although it could not transform, if it wanted to go against Li Mu might not be its match. However, the Tao bell's intelligence did not seem to be very high. It had not realized this yet. Li Mu could not give it a chance to react. After returning to White Cloud Peak and heaving a sigh of relief, Li Mu began to recall the feeling of killing the illusion god's avatar that day. That was the first time he had released the demon-slaying protective curse. Based on Li Mu's understanding of this curse, the first two moves of this curse could be used by Realm 4 cultivators. However, the last two moves were Realm 5 Abhijna. Among them, the third move was a defensive move. The Taiji diagram that was formed could even dissolve a Realm 6 attack. The last move seemed to specialize in attacking the primordial spirit. The speed of the Sword of Wisdom was unbelievably fast. The illusion god's avatar did not even have time to react before his primordial spirit was destroyed. Li Mu still did not understand the use of the Tao Te Ching. The 9 syllables of truth were mostly supportive. The demon-slaying protective curse was the strongest Tao technique that Li Mu could use at the moment. With the support of the last two moves and with Su He by his side, he was not afraid of ordinary Realm 6 cultivators. It seemed like he had only crossed half a realm. However, this half a realm was something that 99% of Realm 5 cultivators could not cross. Li Mu sat cross-legged on the bed and continued to comprehend. Suddenly, he sensed something and opened his eyes to look ahead. Outside the window, a shadow flashed past. Li Mu flew off the bed and came to the courtyard. However, he did not see anything. He pretended to return to his room. However, he suddenly turned around and looked up at the sky. A corner of the Tao bell appeared in the clouds above his head. However, it quickly shrank back. Li Mu was shocked. Did the Tao bell finally understand that he was no match for him? Was it here to seek revenge? However, it did not seem like it. Li Mu only glanced at it and it hid in the clouds. If it was here to seek revenge, it would not be so cowardly. Li Mu turned and walked back to his room. However, he secretly stuck a paper figurine on the door. After he entered the room, he silently observed from the paper figurine's perspective. In the clouds, the Tao bell's shadow appeared again. It first carefully lowered its height. When it saw that Li Mu did not come out, it quickly flew to where Li Mu was standing and slowly rotated. Li Mu looked at it strangely. He did not know what the Dao Bell was up to. He carefully observed the Dao Bell through the paper figurine. The Dao Bell was about 10 feet tall. Its body was so thick that it would take several people to wrap their arms around it. Li Mu had not looked at it carefully before. Now that he looked at it closely, he realized that there were complicated runes on the Dao Bell. These runes were simple and ancient, but they were also quite beautiful. However, there was a deep crack on the Dao Bell. While it destroyed a few of the runes, it also destroyed some of the Dao Bell's beauty. The culprit behind this crack was Li Mu. Li Mu was actually quite aggrieved about this matter. He had only recited a few incantations. Reciting incantations was not against the law. The Dao Bell seemed to have a function. It was to magnify the changes in the power of heaven and earth caused by new magical powers and Dao techniques. When Li Mu cast a spell in Yangqiu County, the changes in the power of heaven and earth were not felt by the powerhouses of Mount Baiyun. However, the Dao Bell could magnify the fluctuations. Li Mu could imagine what it would be like when it tried to magnify the power of heaven and earth caused by the Dao De Jing. Even someone as reckless as Li Mu would not dare to recite it casually unless it was a matter of life and death. He wished that its power would be weakened by 10 times or even 100 times. This Dao Bell actually wanted to magnify it. It was simply seeking death more than Li Mu himself. However, even though Dao Zhong was courting death, Li Mu still couldn't shirk his responsibility in this matter. He carefully observed the Dao Bell's rotation on the spot. He was gradually surprised to find that as it rotated, the edge of the crack on the Dao Bell emitted an extremely weak golden light. Li Mu was stunned. Could this Dao Bell be repairing itself? But why did it come here to repair itself? Could it be that there was something around Li Mu that could help it repair itself? Li Mu carefully probed and did not feel anything unusual around him. However, the Dao Bell's spiritual sense was many times stronger than that of a human. Perhaps it could sense something that Li Mu could not. Li Mu walked out of the room again. The Dao Bell immediately flew up and hid in the clouds again. Li Mu stood in the courtyard and looked at the clouds in the sky. He said, "You don't have to hide anymore. I can see you." The Dao Bell flew out from the clouds and buzzed non-stop. It was unknown what it was saying. Although Li Mu could not understand its words, it was obvious that the Dao Bell could understand Li Mu's meaning. Li Mu looked up at it and said, "I didn't do it on purpose last time. Come down." The Dao Bell buzzed for a while. Not only did it not come down, but it flew even higher. Li Mu thought for a while and said, "I swear on the heavenly Dao that I won't do anything to you. I'll just stand here and not move." After the Dao Bell stopped in the air for a while, it seemed like it wanted to escape, but it also seemed like it couldn't bear to let go of something. After a while, it tried to descend a little, then a little more. When it saw that Li Mu didn't move, it gradually became bolder and flew to Li Mu's side. It circled around him continuously. Li Mu noticed that there were more golden light spots on the cracks on the Dao Bell. The cracks seemed to be slowly mending at a speed that was not visible to the naked eye. This meant that he had something that the Dao Bell needed. However, Li Mu carefully probed and did not find anything missing. It was not spiritual power, psyche power, or any other power within his body. After the Dao Bell spun for a while, the golden light spots on the cracks dissipated, and the cracks seemed to be mending a little. Li Mu could not figure it out. He simply said, "I was the one who caused the cracks on your body. I have the responsibility to help you repair them. What do you need? I can help you." Li Mu had clearly gained some trust from the Dao Bell. The Dao Bell buzzed again. Although there were no specific syllables or words, Li Mu miraculously understood its meaning. Li Mu asked in surprise, "You need a new mystique Dao technique?" The Dao Bell danced up and down, clearly indicating that it was nodding. Li Mu reached out and touched the cracks on the Dao Bell. This time, the Dao Bell not only did not dodge, but it even rubbed against his hand. However, it was huge and Li Mu was almost knocked over by it. He patted the Dao Bell and said casually, "You're so big. It's not convenient for you to be beside me. Can you shrink a little?" The Dao Bell buzzed and shrank rapidly. Finally, it became a small bell the size of a palm. It jumped up and down and circled around Li Mu. Li Mu looked at the scene in front of him in shock and exclaimed, "It really can." Chapter 324. It was Li Mu who had cracked the Fulu school's Dao bell, so he had the responsibility to repair it. According to the message conveyed by the Dao bell, every time a new Dao technique or divine ability was created, a strange power would descend. It relied on this strange power to repair itself. In theory, as long as Li Mu could continuously create new divine abilities or Dao techniques, it would quickly be repaired. Although Li Mu did not have this ability, he had the support of Taoism from another world. Speaking of which, there were many things that were fated to happen. In his previous life, he had been seriously ill. He had tried Western medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, but none of them were effective. His mother had suffered a blow because of this, but she did not want to give up. In the end, she had placed her hopes on metaphysics. During that time, she had worshipped and entered every temple she saw. She had brought home Buddhist beads consecrated by eminent monks and Fulu personally written by a half-immortal. Not only that, but because of Li Mu's illness, his mother, who had originally been an atheist, had also started to worship Buddhism and Taoism. She had bought a lot of Buddhist and Taoist scriptures and read them day and night, praying for Buddha and Taoists to bless Li Mu's recovery. Even though Li Mu did not believe in metaphysics at that time, he did not want his mother to lose hope. Therefore, he forced himself to memorize some Buddhist scriptures and Taoist scriptures. When he had nothing to do, he would flip through the mountains of books at home. However, ever since his parents had gone to a mountain to worship Buddha and their car had accidentally rolled off a cliff, Li Mu had never touched these things again. After coming to this world, Li Mu gradually realized that the things he had abandoned in the past had great power in this world. Unfortunately, Li Mu had already used the 9 words mantra, the demon-slaying protection incantation, and other Dao techniques countless times. What the Dao bell needed could only be found when a Dao technique first appeared. However, this was not a problem. There were many Taoist Dharma spells. Just the Thunder Dharma alone had more than 100 types of Dharma spells. Although they were all Thunder Dharma spells, their powers were all different. The Lin formula was the fastest and strongest Thunder Dharma spell. The others appeared to be of little value. Li Mu did not even try them. Although it was of little value, it was something that had never existed in this world before. Once it was used, it would be a brand new divine ability. Apart from these, there were too many spells in the exalted 3 divine caves incantation that Li Mu didn't try. The reason was that although many spells had different incantations and hand seals, their effects were the same. There were countless types of lightning spells, and it was enough to learn one. Since there were already ready-made spells in this world, Li Mu didn't need to spend a lot of time and energy trying out the corresponding hand seals. He only felt a little regretful now. If he had known that this day would come, he would have read all the Taoist and Buddhist scriptures. Perhaps he would have more trump cards now. Li Mu put these thoughts away. When he was in Yangqiu County, he had spent a lot of time trying out the incantations that he remembered. At that time, he had only condensed one spirit of cultivation. Many times, when he felt that using those Dharma spells would backfire on him, he would immediately stop. Now that his cultivation had reached the level of divine ability, it was naturally no problem for him to use those Dharma spells of the past. Li Mu's left hand formed the thunder seal and said silently, "Flying hellfire, divine thunder. Up and down Tai Chi, the 4 dimensions of the world. Overturning the heavens and overturning the mountains, boiling the seas and destroying the mountains. The 6 dragon drum vibrates and orders the pursuit. Urgent as the Dharma commands." As his voice fell, a white thunderbolt descended from the sky. Li Mu waved his hand and dispersed it. The Dao bell, which had already turned into the size of Li Mu's palm, let out a crisp sound. It spun around Li Mu. Golden spots of light began to appear on the cracks on the bell. Seeing that this method was indeed effective, Li Mu's hand's seal changed into the green spirit seal. He silently chanted the snow prayer incantation, "Flying hellfire, east spirit. Superior immortal master, auspicious light condenses. Astral wind scissors water, change jade flower. Majestic righteousness, heaven and earth cleanse. True king perfunctory, divine transformation jade sutra. Urgent as the Dharma commands." Not long after the incantation was finished, Snowflakes fluttered in the air and fell from the sky. The Dao bell flew up and down in the snow. It was as lively as a dog. Li Mu stretched out his hand. A snowflake landed on his hand and slowly melted. In the past, he had thought that only spells that used insignificant cultivation to stir up the power of heaven and earth could be called Taoist spells. Later on, he gradually realized that spells that were classified as supernatural powers, such as summoning wind and summoning rain and praying snow, could also be called Taoist spells. The essence of Taoist spells was to use one's own Dharma powers to trigger changes in heaven and earth. The reason why they were not classified as Taoist spells was because cultivators were used to thinking that Taoist spells were bound to be powerful. These spells were not worthy of being called Taoist spells. However, to Li Mu, although these spells were not very powerful, they could still be of great use when gathered together. However, Li Mu did not intend to hand over all his stock today. He stroked the Dao bell and said, "Let's call it a day. We'll come back tomorrow." The Dao bell circled around Li Mu a few times. It seemed to be reluctant to part with him. After a long time, it turned into a stream of light and disappeared in the direction of the main peak. Wan and Xiao Bai had run off somewhere. Li Mu returned to his room. He was bored to death. He took out the spirit snail and inserted a strand of Dharma powers. From last night until now, Zhou Yi's heart had been restless. She thought countless times about whether what she did to Li Mu in the past was too much. If he was angry, what would she do if he stayed in the North County and did not return to the divine capital? Should she sincerely apologize to him? She did not sleep the whole night. She kept thinking about this problem, until Li Mu's voice came from the spirit snail. He seemed to have forgotten about last night's unhappiness and did not mention it again. Only then did Zhou Yi relax. At the same time, she was also gratified. Although he was sometimes petty and willful, he was still very reasonable most of the time. Today, when he was chatting with the Empress, Li Mu did not dare to be unreasonable. He had thought about it thoroughly today. The Empress was so innocent. It was too inhumane to use such tricks on such an innocent girl. Of course, he was also worried that he would have nightmares again at night. Li Mu did not mention what happened last night. He only mentioned the Dao bell to the Empress. Dao bell? After hearing this, Zhou Yi said, "I've only heard that it is the spiritual treasure of the Fulu school. I've never seen it before." Fulu school was one of the 6 Taoist sects. Li Mu originally thought that the spiritual treasure of such a sect would be very impressive. He did not expect such a cowardly bell to be the spiritual treasure of a sect. In Li Mu's eyes, it seemed to have no other use other than being a Taoist detector. Zhou Yi continued. According to historical records, the ancestral court of Fulu school has encountered many crises in the history of the school. They were all resolved by this bell. Li Mu was stunned. He said in disbelief, "This bell is so powerful?" Zhou Yi said, "This bell is not ordinary. Its sound can not only purify one's Taoist heart, but it can also be used to shock enemies. The bell can be big or small. When it is small, it is like sand. When it is big, it is like a mountain. It is also the strongest defensive treasure known to the cultivation world." Hundreds of years ago, when the ancestral court of Fulu school was besieged by the demon sect, it was the Dao bell that covered Mount Baiyun. The demon sect's several transcendents and more than 10 Dongxian experts were unable to break through. Li Mu was extremely suspicious. Was the Dao bell that ran away when it saw him and the Dao bell that the Empress was talking about the same? If the Dao bell was really so powerful, how could it be cracked because of the Dao De Ching? Li Mu quickly realized that this might not be the Dao bell's fault. It dared to infinitely amplify the power of heaven and earth activated by the Dao De Ching. The fact that the Dao bell had only cracked a small crack was enough to show its strength. If that was the case, if he obtained the Dao bell and couldn't defeat his opponent head-on, all he had to do was shrink into the bell and he would be in an invincible position. This was the direction that a qualified cultivator should strive to cultivate in. He didn't expect the cowardly bell to be so powerful. When he thought about hiding in the Dao bell and fighting, Li Mu's heart immediately burned with passion. He couldn't help but look forward to the next day. After chatting with the Empress for a while, Li Mu put away the conch and sorted out the spells in his mind that he hadn't used yet. The next morning, Li Mu woke up early and went to the courtyard. At the same time, on the main peak, nearly 100 disciples of the Fu school had also started their daily morning classes. For cultivators, cultivating the heart was extremely important. Once the heart of cultivation wasn't firm or unstable, one's cultivation would stagnate and regress. In serious cases, one would suffer from qi deviation or even death. Thus, the disciples of the 7 branches would take turns every 7 days to ascend the main peak and listen to the sound of the Tao bell. The Tao bell was the treasure of the Fu school. It emitted a certain sound that could cleanse a cultivator's heart and reduce the possibility of inner demons breeding. A group of disciples sat cross-legged in the square in front of the Tao palace on the main peak. They closed their eyes and focused, preparing to be cleansed by the Tao bell. However, they sat for a long time and didn't hear the sound of the bell. Finally, someone couldn't help but look up. He realized that there were only a few white clouds above his head. There was no sign of the Tao bell. He was stunned. "Where's the bell?" "White cloud peak." Li Mu withdrew his hand and looked at the Tao bell that was flying toward him. A fervent smile appeared on his face. If the Empress hadn't reminded him, he wouldn't have realized that the Tao bell was a treasure. If he could trick it into his hands. Thinking of this, Li Mu's smile widened. The Tao bell that was flying toward him suddenly stopped. Then, as if it had been frightened, it quickly retreated and hid in the clouds. Li Mu was stunned. Could it be that his smile was too perverted and scared the cowardly bell? He coughed softly and tried his best to make his smile normal. He waved his hand at the cloud and said, "Come down. I just cast a new spell for you." The Tao bell peeked out a corner of the cloud and quickly retreated. Li Mu thought to himself that he had been careless. Given the Tao bell's personality, if he scared it this time, it probably wouldn't be so easy to get close to it next time. Li Mu didn't say anything else. His hand gestures changed rapidly as he silently chanted a spell. Jade Purity's signal. Descend the lightning. 3 departments and 6 residences, left and right spirit lords. Crystal of the sun, flowing light of the moon. Sweep away the evil and destroy all disasters. The celestial emperor receives the wind and commands the sky. In thy name in my palm. Grasp the heaven and earth, protect me. After casting several new spells in succession, a buzzing sound finally came from the clouds. The Tao bell flew out of the clouds and cheerfully flew toward Li Mu. Chapter 325. Baiyun Mountain, Main Peak Plaza. The morning class had already begun, but the Tao bell did not ring. A few elders walked out of the Tao palace and looked at the chaotic disciples in the plaza. They asked, "What's going on?" A disciple said in fear, "Elder, the Tao bell ran away." The elder's expression changed. "What?" The Tao bell was an important treasure of Baiyun Mountain. For thousands of years, it had saved the ancestral court from danger several times. Fulu school had always treated it like an ancestor. If anything happened to the Tao bell, the entire Baiyun Mountain would experience an earthquake. The elders asked in unison, "Where did the Tao bell go?" A disciple pointed in a certain direction and said, "I saw the Tao bell go that way just now." The elders flew up at the same time and flew in the direction that the disciple pointed. When they passed by Baiyun Mountain, they suddenly heard a crisp and cheerful bell ring from below. They immediately stopped. Hearing the Tao bell ring again, everyone was relieved. They flew down Baiyun Mountain to investigate. The Tao bell flew away from the main peak during the morning class. This had never happened in decades. They floated in the air and saw a young man standing in the courtyard of the small building on Baiyun Mountain. The Tao bell had shrunk to the size of a palm and was flying around him. It looked extremely cheerful. When they saw the young man's appearance, everyone was stunned. Yesterday, the Tao bell was so scared that it hid in the clouds and did not dare to come out. Why did it become like this today? They had been on Baiyun Mountain for decades, but they had never seen the Tao bell so close to anyone. The thoughts of a spiritual treasure were truly difficult to guess. However, it was fine as long as the Tao bell was still in Fulu school. An elder looked down and said, "Senior Tao bell, the disciples on the main peak are still waiting for you. Li Mu looked at the Tao bell and said, "That's all for today. I'll continue to help you another day." The Tao bell reluctantly flew around Li Mu a few times. Then, it drew an arc in the air and flew towards the main peak. Several elders nodded to Li Mu in the sky, then left with doubtful looks on their faces. The Tao bell held an extraordinary significance to Fulu school. Anything related to the Tao bell was no small matter. After the morning class, in the Tao palace on the main peak, several elders immediately reported this matter to the headmaster. Dao Zhong left the morning class for no reason. This has never happened in the past few decades. There must be something fishy going on. Yesterday, it was very afraid of fellow Taoist Li, but today, it has become so close. There must be a reason. This is an important matter. Sect leader, you must pay attention to it. On the main seat, the white-haired old man pinched his fingers and calculated. Then, he said, he should have something to hide the secrets of the heavens. I can't calculate the relationship between him and the Tao bell. One of the elders said doubtfully, why would he have such an item for no reason? He has approached Fulu school several times. There must be some unspeakable secret between him and the Tao bell. Could he be a spy from the demon sect who approached Fulu school with ill intentions towards the Tao bell? Another Taoist priest said, Elder Su, you think too highly of the demon sect. Not only is he junior sister Lu's future Taoist companion, but he is also the Empress' favorite minister. Do you think the Empress of Great Zhou would treat a spy from the demon sect as her favorite minister? That's true. Elder Su shook his head and asked, but what happened between him and the Tao bell? I have been in the sect for several decades, but I have never seen such a phenomenon. The Fulu school's head teacher's lips trembled slightly. A moment later, the Tao bell flew in from outside. It circled the Fulu school's head teacher and buzzed for a while. The Fulu school's head teacher stood up and observed the cracks on the Tao bell. Not long after, a look of surprise appeared on his face. He muttered, there's such a thing. Everyone rarely saw such an expression on the head teacher's face. They asked curiously, head teacher, what happened? The head teacher said, he is helping the Tao bell repair the cracks on it. The elders could not help but be shocked when they heard this. How is that possible? Repairing the Tao bell requires the origin energy of heaven and earth. The origin energy of heaven and earth is extremely rare. It can only be produced in large quantities when a new Taoist technique is produced. Once the origin energy is produced, it will dissipate soon and cannot be stored. How can he have it? What method did he use to help the Tao bell repair it? The Tao bell buzzed a few more times. The Fulu school's head teacher revealed a look of understanding. He said, I see. A moment later, they learned the whole story. In the Tao palace on the main peak, the elders looked at each other in shock. Li Mu really was using the origin energy of heaven and earth produced when a new Taoist technique was produced to repair the Tao bell. This matter was far more unbelievable than him being able to repair the Tao bell. There was no way to verify how the earliest Taoist techniques were created. Most of the Taoist techniques that the current cultivators practiced were inherited from the ancients. However, in every era, there was no lack of outstanding people who could create their own Taoist techniques. These people were often the brightest stars in the night sky of that era. Even the head teacher could not compare to these people. It was not just the head teacher. The transcendence of the 6 Taoist sects, the 4 Buddhist sects, the 10 demonic path sects, the deans of the Great Zhou's 4 great academies, and even the Empress of the Great Zhou, these were the strongest people known on the continent. But they were far from being outstanding. They were able to advance to the transcendence realm by relying on the legacies of their sects, academies, and the imperial court. They relied on the influence of their predecessors and did not rely on themselves. The imperial family had the emperor's qi. The academies and the various sects also had their own legacies. Strictly speaking, they could not be considered true transcendents. A true transcendence expert was someone who transcended the rules and traditions. They created their own Taoist techniques and were able to embark on their own path of cultivation. Li Mu was clearly not such a genius. If he could create a Taoist technique of this level, a great phenomenon would descend on Mount Bayun. At that time, everyone would be able to sense it. Even so, the fact that he was able to innovate within the traditional framework was not something an ordinary cultivator could do. At least, no one in the Fulu school could do it. In the current cultivation world, perhaps only some of Xuanzong's seniors had such abilities. The Fulu school was dedicated to researching Fulu. Xuanzong was passionate about researching Taoist techniques. For thousands of years, Xuanzong had made many improvements to the existing Taoist techniques. For example, they shortened the incantations, simplified the hand seals, sped up the casting time, increased the power of the Taoist techniques, and so on. Li Mu had done these. Of course, his Taoist techniques, incantations, and hand seals might not be shorter or fewer, but they were still considered new Taoist techniques. He used this method to obtain the origin power of heaven and earth to help repair the Tao Bell. Elder Su praised, "Even so, it's very rare for him to have such an understanding of Taoist techniques at such a young age." Another Taoist priest said, "If Senior Miao Dun of Xuanzong knew about this, she would probably regret it very much." Last time, she invited fellow Taoist Li to join Xuanzong. After being rejected, she did not insist. If fellow Taoist Li joins Xuanzong, he will definitely become a prodigy of Xuanzong in the future. The Fulu school's headmaster's eyes lit up. He said, "I'm afraid that in the future, a true transcendence expert will appear in Great Zhou." The sect master's words caused the elders to be extremely astonished. Everyone knew very well what a true transcendence expert meant. It had been too many years since a true transcendence expert appeared in the cultivation world. A powerhouse who relied on his own strength to step into the upper realm without relying on an inheritance was far stronger than an ordinary transcendence expert. They did not expect the headmaster to have such a high evaluation of him. At first, they felt that it was too much. Thinking about it carefully, when others cursed the heavens, there was a certain possibility of being struck by lightning. The scene of him cursing the heavens was earth-shattering. Even the Tao Bell cracked because of it. Although his cultivation was not high, in terms of understanding of the heavenly Tao, there were probably not many people who could compare to him. Elder Su thought for a moment and said, "If such a person can stay in our Fulu school, it's very likely that he will become a pillar of the ancestral court in the future." Another elder sighed and said, "It's too late. Half a year ago, it was still possible. Now, he's already one of the Empress people. If we keep him in the Fulu school, even if he's willing, the Empress won't be willing. Moreover, he has refused to join the sect twice. This time, he probably won't agree." Elder Su thought of something and said with a smile, "It's fine. With junior sister Lu here, he's already half a member of the Fulu school. As long as we treat him well, he'll always treat our Fulu school differently. In addition, he's a favored official of the Empress. Perhaps he can further deepen our relationship with the imperial court." After the Tao Bell left, Li Mu waited on Baiyun Peak. According to his guess, the main peak would send someone over soon. The Tao Bell was the most important treasure of the Fulu school. They would definitely not let Li Mu seduce it. They would definitely come to ask about it. In this short period of time, Li Mu had even prepared an excuse. If they asked, he would say that these spells were all inherited from his master. Although they might not believe him, they would not search his soul to confirm it. Not to mention that searching his soul was useless. Even if the Fulu school was one of the 6 great Taoist sects, they would not dare to treat him this way. Now, he did not represent himself alone. Behind him stood the Empress and the imperial court. In the Great Zhou, the most powerful force was not the demonic path, nor the 6 schools and 4 great sects. It was the imperial court. Sure enough, as Li Mu expected, after only an hour, someone landed on Baiyun Peak. Li Mu opened the courtyard door and saw an elder standing outside. Li Mu knew that this person's surname was Su. He was an elder of the main peak. Elder Su smiled and asked, "Lord Li, are you used to living here?" Li Mu nodded and said, "The scenery here is pleasant and quiet. It is a good place for cultivation." Elder Su smiled and said, "That's good. If Lord Li has any requests, you can tell me. I will arrange it for you as soon as possible." The talisman puppet sect elder's attitude towards him seemed to be better than before. A trace of suspicion surfaced in Li Mu's heart as he asked, "Elder Su, is there anything important that you're here for?" Elder Su smiled again and said, "I am here on the orders of the headmaster to thank Lord Li for helping to repair the Dao Bell." Li Mu said, "It is my duty. The Dao Bell was damaged because of me. I will do my best to restore it to its original state." Elder Su shook his head and said, "Lord Li did not mean to damage the Dao Bell, but you did mean to repair it. Whether you can repair it or not, the Fulu school owes you a favor." Elder Su's attitude surprised Li Mu. If the Fulu school's attitude towards him before was polite, then this time it was warm. Not only that, he did not ask about anything else. The reason Li Mu had prepared was useless. Before Elder Su left, he had actually left behind some gifts. There were some spiritual jades of good quality, some alchemical pills that could recover one's magic power, and also talismans that could gather spiritual qi. When Li Mu and the Empress were chatting that night, they brought up this matter. The Empress was silent for a moment, and then asked, "Could it be that the talisman sect is trying to rope you in?" Li Mu said, "Your Majesty, don't worry. I am loyal to your Majesty. I only have your Majesty in my heart. I will not join the Fulu school." Zhou Yi did not seem to be worried about this. He only asked, "Then when will you be back?" Li Mu had 3 months of leave. He had only been away for half a month. Lu Hanyan still had not come out of seclusion. He would need at least 2 months before he could return. But the Empress's tone made Li Mu feel like he was a little wife who did not plan to return home after returning to her mother's home. He could not say that he would return in 2 months. He could only say, "I will be back as soon as possible." Chapter 326. Although Li Mu told the Empress that he would do it as soon as possible, it was definitely not that soon. He did not know when Lu Hanyan would come out of seclusion. After she came out, Li Mu would have to accompany her for at least a month. He would also have to persuade her to come back to Fairy's capital with him as soon as possible. This would probably delay them for a while. Besides, Li Mu also had the heavy responsibility of repairing the Dao Bell. He was the one who cracked the Dao Bell. If he did not take responsibility for it, then what was the difference between him and those scumbags who ran away after cheating a girl's first time? Repairing the Dao Bell was a time-consuming and laborious task. For example, the demon-slaying protective spell, the Tao Te Ching, the 9 syllables mantra, and the like were all very powerful. The first time they were used, they would produce even more origin power. If the Dao Bell did not try to pry into it and only absorb the origin power, it would not only be harmless but also beneficial. Unfortunately, although it was difficult to produce origin power, it was easy to dissipate it. When Li Mu first used it, the Dao Bell was not by Li Mu's side. The origin power had long dissipated. Li Mu could use some small spells and accumulate them. After a few days, the crack on the Dao Bell had only healed by 10 to 20%. If he wanted it to be completely repaired, 2 months would not be enough. Moreover, the spells that he had risked his life to experiment with were almost used up. He still had to spend time trying. Before leaving Mount Baiyun, he could only try his best to help it. After a few more days, Li Mu and the Dao Bell were finally familiar with each other. Its initial fear of Li Mu had long disappeared. Every morning after its morning class, it would fly to his place and only return at night. In addition to helping him repair the cracks, Li Mu had also done some experiments on it in the past few days. The Dao Bell was very hard. Even if Li Mu used the Qingxian sword to cut it, it would not leave any mark. Not only was it difficult to be hurt by swords, but it was also immune to spells. At least, all the spells that Li Mu, who was in the transcendent realm, could cast could not shake it at all. It was impervious to lightning, impervious to fire and water, and even if tens of thousands of swords were launched simultaneously, it would not even tremble in the slightest. No wonder the Empress had said that it was the strongest defensive treasure known to the cultivation world. With this treasure, he would be in an invincible position no matter who he fought. Even if the other party was in the transcendent realm, Li Mu wouldn't be able to harm him, and he wouldn't be able to break through the defense of the Dao Bell. Of course, Li Mu had never fought against a transcendent powerhouse before. If he really did encounter such a powerhouse, even if the other party couldn't break the Dao Bell, they could still trap him inside. However, the prerequisite for all of this was that Li Mu had the treasure. But that was impossible. For thousands of years, the Law Bell had been the treasure of Fulu School. No matter who tried to steal it, the Fulu School would fight them to the death. After thinking this through, Li Mu no longer harbored any thoughts about the bell. In an uninhabited valley somewhere in Baiyun Mountain, Li Mu whistled, and the Dao Bell in the distance flew back. From the size of a palm, it immediately grew to a huge bell that was about 10 feet tall, enveloping Li Mu within it. Then, the body of the bell immediately turned transparent. Li Mu, who was within the bell, could also see the situation outside. He formed a seal with his hands. Suddenly, there was a violent wind, lightning, rain, and snow outside. Through his experiments over the past few days, Li Mu discovered that while he was within the Dao Bell, others couldn't attack him. However, it didn't affect him from using spells to attack others. Not only that, Li Mu took out a Fulu. After throwing it out, the Fulu actually passed through the transparent bell. This meant that the defense of the bell was one-way controllable. It could block attacks from outside the bell, but it had almost no effect on the person within the bell. No wonder the Fulu School treated it as the treasure of the sect. The ability of this bell was indeed worthy of this title. Li Mu sighed. The more he understood about the Dao Bell, the stronger his desire to own it. However, he also knew that this was someone else's possession. He couldn't take it, nor could he. Li Mu whistled again. The Dao Bell flew away from his head and turned back to the size of a palm. It floated on Li Mu's shoulder and spun nonstop. Li Mu tilted his head and glanced at it. You go back first. I'll walk around alone. The Dao Bell buzzed for a while before reluctantly flying away. During the days when Lu Hanyan was in seclusion, Li Mu was actually quite bored on Mount Baiyun. Wan Wan and Xiao Bai were obedient to Li Mu. The Dao Bell was as obedient as Li Mu's dog. At this time, Li Mu vaguely understood the loneliness of the Empress. In life, one needed friends and enemies. If one's life was as calm as a pool of stagnant water, then the same day would just be repeating itself. This was the loneliness of cultivation. In the past, Li Mu's 7 spirits weren't complete. When his life was threatened, he could still endure the loneliness. Now, if he were to cultivate in seclusion for several months, he might not be able to sit still. Compared to the boring cultivation, he preferred to fight with the officials of the old and new parties in Luoyang. He wanted to help the people uphold justice and redress grievances. This way, he could obtain their psychokinesis. This was not boring, and it was also faster than cultivating in seclusion. This could also be considered a shortcut to cultivation, but very few cultivators chose to do so. This time, Li Mu hadn't seen Hanja before coming to Mount Baiyun. This place was not far from the 5th peak. Li Mu flew to the 5th peak and asked the disciple guarding the peak to report. Soon, Hanja came with the wind. Before he arrived, his voice came first. He said to Li Mu from afar, I heard that you came to Ancestral Court. I was worried that I would disturb you and Lu, Martial Uncle Lu, so I didn't look for you. Li Mu said, after I came to Mount Baiyun, Han Yen has been in seclusion. Hanja looked at him and said, then why didn't you come and drink with me? Li Mu smiled and said, let's go to Mount Baiyun for a drink? When Lu Hanyan was here, the difference in status between the two made Hanja embarrassed to appear in front of her. After all, although she was Li Mu's woman, she was also his martial uncle. Hearing that Lu Hanyan was not here, Hanja said straightforwardly, let's go. Wait for me, wait for me. A figure flew from behind. Junior sister Qin landed beside the two and said, bring me along. Hanja looked at her and asked, why didn't you cultivate properly? What are you doing here? Junior sister Qin glanced at him and said, I want to go too. Hanja shook his head and said, I'm going to drink with my friends. Why are you joining in the fun? Junior sister Qin said unhappily, are you the only one who is Big Brother Li's friend? I'm also his friend. We've already met 3 times. Big Brother Li, don't you think I'm your friend? Looking at Junior sister Qin's somewhat pleading eyes, Li Mu nodded and said, yes. Since Junior sister Qin wants to go, let's go together. Hanja did not stop her. He just sighed and said, "If you slack off like this, when can you reach the spirit realm? Senior brother Chin asked me to take care of you. Fortunately, you're a girl." Junior sister Chin was stunned for a moment. Then, she asked with a red face, "What's wrong with being a girl?" Hanja looked at her and said, "You're so disobedient. If you weren't a girl, I would have already beaten you." Junior sister Chin's face turned from red to white and then to green. She turned her head away in a fit of pique. Li Mu shook his head and said, "Let's go." On Baiyun Peak. In the small building on the peak, Wan Wan and Xiao Bai were busy preparing dishes in the kitchen. Junior sister Chin was observing and learning from the side. Li Mu and Hanja sat at the stone table in the courtyard. Hanja asked, "How have you been in Shendu recently?" Li Mu said, "Not bad." Hanja said, "I heard that the officials and nobles in Shendu are different from the disciples and elders of our sect. They're very shrewd and scheming against each other. If you're not careful, you'll die without a burial place. You have to be careful there." Li Mu said, "It's okay. Actually, most of them are quite simple-minded." He took out a pot of wine from the flask space and poured a cup for Hanja. He said, "Try it." Hanja took a sip. He felt that the wine was mellow and full of spiritual qi. One sip was equivalent to a day of his cultivation. He could not help but ask in surprise, "What wine is this?" Li Mu said, "The tribute wine from Hanyang County. It's not bad, right?" Hanja clicked his tongue and said, "You can even drink the tribute wine. Looks like you're doing well in Shendu." The tribute wine was given by the Empress. Li Mu's house was filled with gifts from the Empress. Although he had not been to many places, he was very familiar with the specialties of the 36 counties. The tribute wine from Hanyang County was the best. The tribute pear skin from Jiangyin County was thin and juicy. The tea leaves from South County were sweet and refreshing. The silk from East County was sold well in many countries. Ever since that incident, in order to make up for the harm she had done to Li Mu, the Empress had been bestowing him with gifts every 2 to 3 days. Although the house was big, it was a bit full now. Last time, she had said that she wanted to bestow Li Mu with a bigger house, but he had rejected her. The Empress had treated him even better. A house with 5 entrances could only be lived in by officials of the 4th rank or higher. If he changed to a bigger house, it was inevitable that there would be some rumors in the court. They would say that Li Mu had used his face to charm the Empress. Of all the court officials in the court, he was the only one she favored. But of course, after the imperial examination, Li Mu had used facts to slap those people in the face. He also told them that he was able to gain the Empress' favor not just because of his face. Even if the Empress wanted to reward him with a bigger house, it was in exchange for his identity as the top scholar in both the civil and military examinations. However, he and Xiaobai were already used to living in that house. There was no need to torment it. The wine was sweet but not intoxicating. This was also the reason why Li Mu was not worried about letting Hanja drink it. Hanja drank a few cups and suddenly thought of something. He looked at Li Mu and said, "That's right. 2 months ago, Junior sister Li returned to the mountain gate once." Li Mu raised his wine cup and slowly put it down. He asked, "Is she still at Mount Baiyun?" Hanja shook his head and said, "She left. She won't be coming back in the future." Li Mu was stunned and asked, "What do you mean?" Hanja looked at him and explained, "She has already left the Fulu school. From now on, she is no longer a disciple of the Fulu school." This news caught Li Mu off guard. He stared at Hanja and asked, "Why?" Hanja took another sip of wine and said, "I don't know the exact details. I only heard it from the disciples of the 7th peak. The Fulu school has never forced non-core disciples to stay or leave. I originally wanted to ask Junior sister Li why she left, but by the time I found out about this, she had already left the sect." Chapter 327. Last time, when he had parted ways with Li Qing, Li Mu had felt that she seemed to have something on her mind. After learning that she had left the Fulu school, Li Mu was even more certain of this thought. Although the Fulu school had 7 peaks and 7 branches of disciples, From a certain perspective, there were only two kinds of disciples in the Fulu school: core disciples and non-core disciples. Core disciples were disciples who had access to the core secrets of the Fulu school. These core secrets were either the Fulu techniques that were not taught to outsiders, or the Taoist techniques that were not taught to non-core disciples. These disciples could not casually leave the Fulu school. Even if they wanted to leave, their memories of the sect's secrets would be erased. Non-core disciples could not come into contact with these secrets. They only cultivated ordinary techniques, and the Fulu Taoist techniques that they studied were also made public. Unlike outsiders, they could obtain certain cultivation resources from the sect by completing sect missions. For example, in the past, Li Qing had worked as a constable in the Yangqiu County government for a year. When she returned to the sect, she could exchange for spiritual jades, transcendent artifacts, and other items for cultivation. Non-core disciples could leave the sect, but very few people did so. After all, since ancient times, the great Zhou had emphasized etiquette and respect for teachers. This was a tradition engraved in the bones of every person in the great Zhou. For cultivators, the sect was their home. Almost every cultivator had a strong sense of belonging to their own sect. For a cultivator to leave the sect, it was no different from a mortal severing their relationship with their parents. In the eyes of some extreme people, leaving the sect for no reason was no different from apostasy. Li Mu understood Li Qing very well. She was a person who valued relationships and righteousness. She would not abandon a subordinate that had nothing to do with her. How could she suddenly leave the sect that she had lived in for 10 years? Thinking of how Li Qing seemed to have some hidden troubles before they parted ways, Li Mu was certain that she had left the sect for some reason. When he thought of this, he could not sit still. He was eager to find out why Li Qing was so good at Fulu school. When Li Mu stood up and turned to leave, Hanja asked in surprise, "Where are you going?" Li Mu didn't even turn his head and said, "I have something to do, so I have to go out. Let junior sister Qin accompany you for a few drinks." Hanja looked at junior sister Qin, who was walking towards him, and shook his head. "Junior sister Qin, how many cups can you drink?" A moment later, junior sister Qin carried the drunk Hanja on her back. She turned around and waved at Wan Wan and Xiaobai, saying, "When Brother Li comes back, tell him that we're going back first." Xiaobai sat at the stone table in the courtyard, resting her chin on one hand. She looked in the direction of the main peak and muttered, "Where did our benefactor go? Who is junior sister Li? Shu?" Wan Wan made a shushing gesture and said, "Don't mention this name in the future, especially in front of Mississippi. Don't mention it even once." White Cloud Mountain, main peak. After Li Mu arrived at the main peak, the Dao Bell sensed him and flew over happily. Li Mu patted it and said, "I'm here to find Elder Su. Help me call him." The Dao Bell flew away with a whoosh and soon flew back. There was still a person inside the bell. Li Mu rubbed his forehead. The Dao Bell didn't seem to understand what call meant. Elder Su was thrown out of the Dao Bell and staggered. When he finally steadied himself, he saw Li Mu in front of him. The Dao Bell shrank and flew to Li Mu's shoulder. It buzzed non-stop as if it was asking for credit. Li Mu looked at Elder Su and said apologetically, "Elder Su, I'm really sorry. I only asked the Dao Bell to inform you. It seems to have misunderstood my intentions." Elder Su was originally drawing a talisman. He was halfway through when the Dao Bell rushed in and swept him away. He was a bit distressed about the talisman materials, but he didn't dare to be angry with the Dao Bell. This ancestor had a strange temperament and was temperamental. If he angered it and made it run away, he wouldn't be able to atone for his sins. Of course, he couldn't blame Li Mu. As an honored guest of the Fulu school and the only hope to speed up the restoration of the Dao Bell, he had to be polite to Li Mu. "It's fine." He smiled at Li Mu and asked, "Lord Li, why are you looking for me?" Li Mu said, "I have a friend who used to be a disciple of the Purple Cloud Peak. For some reason, she left the Fulu school. I want to go to the Purple Cloud Peak to find out more about her, but I don't know many people there. I can only trouble Elder Su." "I see." Elder Su smiled and said, "This is a small matter. I'll go to the Purple Cloud Peak with Lord Li." The Purple Cloud Peak was the 7th peak of the Fulu school. The head of the peak was Yu Quanzi. Li Mu had actually met Yu Quanzi once. When Yu Zhenzi brought Lu Hanyan to extort the peak heads, Li Mu was also present. The heaven-grade armor he was wearing now was given to him by Yu Quanzi. To be precise, Yu Zhenzi had extorted it from him. The two of them flew on a cloud and arrived at the 7th peak in the blink of an eye. When the disciple guarding the peak saw the two of them, he immediately walked forward and bowed to Elder Su. "Greetings, Elder Su." Elder Su asked, "Is Elder Sun here?" A disciple guarding the peak nodded and said, "Elder Sun is on the peak. This disciple will go and report to him." Elder Sun was also an old man. Li Mu had stayed in White Cloud Peak for a long time and found that the fortune elders of the various peaks were mostly old men or old women. On the other hand, the officials of the imperial court who were at the 5th level of cultivation were mostly middle-aged. He did not know whether it was because the imperial court controlled the 36 counties and had more abundant cultivation resources, making it easier for them to create experts, or because the strength of the Fulu school was all roaming outside and not in the sect. After Elder Sun walked out of the Purple Cloud Peak Taoist Palace, Elder Su looked at him and said, "This is Lord Li, an honored guest of our Fulu school. He has a friend who used to be on the 7th peak. He came to the Purple Cloud Peak to ask about the situation of that disciple." Elder Sun smiled and said, "Since you are an honored guest of our sect, let's go in and talk." After entering the Taoist Palace on the left, Elder Su introduced to Li Mu, "In the Purple Cloud Peak, Elder Sun is responsible for the admission and departure of disciples. If Lord Li has any questions, you can ask Elder Sunday." Li Mu nodded and looked at Elder Sunday. He asked, "Elder Sun, do you know Li Qing?" "Li Qing?" Elder Sun was startled at first, then a look of pity appeared on his face. He said, what a pity. She was originally one of the most outstanding disciples of the Purple Cloud Peak. After the grand competition of the peaks, she would have definitely become a core disciple. Unfortunately, she left the sect before the competition. This is a loss to the Purple Cloud Peak. Li Mu continued asking, "Elder Sun, do you know why she left the sect?" Elder Sun shook his head and said, "She didn't say the reason. I tried my best to persuade her that if she had any difficulties, she could tell the sect. However, she was determined to leave, so I didn't try to persuade her anymore. The sect has never restricted the departure of disciples." After coming to the Purple Cloud Peak, Li Mu's heart was not at ease. Instead, it was hanging by a thread. Based on his understanding of Li Qing, she would definitely not leave the sect that had nurtured her for 10 years for no reason. Previously, when the two of them were on a mission together, Li Mu could clearly feel that she had a strong sense of belonging to the Fulu school. In her heart, leaving the sect was tantamount to betrayal. What had happened to her that she did not hesitate to leave the sect and cut ties with the Fulu school? Li Mu suddenly remembered the way Li Qing looked at him when he parted ways with her. At that time, her eyes were filled with confusion and conflict, but in the end, she still chose to leave. It was as if she was cutting ties with Li Mu. If she had encountered something and wanted to cut ties with Li Mu could understand. Based on her personality, she would never let her own matters implicate Li Mu. But her choice to leave the Fulu school made Li Mu feel a lingering fear. He understood Li Qing very well. There were only two possibilities for her to make such a decision. First, what she was about to do might damage the reputation of the Fulu school. As a disciple of the Fulu school, she had a strong sense of belonging to the sect. She did not wish to damage the reputation of the Fulu school because of what she was about to do. Second, what she was about to do might make things difficult for the Fulu school, or even implicate the Fulu school. Li Mu was worried about the second point. The Fulu school was one of the 6 great Taoist sects. The ancestral court had a strong appeal to the various branches of the Fulu school. If she could become a core disciple, the Fulu school would become her backing. But in a situation where the status of a core disciple was so easy to obtain, she still chose to leave. This meant that in her heart, the Fulu school could not protect her. Li Mu did not dare to think about it any further. He asked Taoist priest Sun Chang, "Can I take a look at the file Li Qing entered the sect?" Elder Sun looked troubled. This Although the files of the various peaks disciples were not top secret, they were not something that an outsider could look at just because they wanted to. Elder Su said, "The sect master said that Lord Li is an honored guest of our sect. We must do our best to satisfy his requests." Since it was the sect master's order, Elder Sun no longer hesitated. "Please follow me." The three of them arrived at a small room in the Taoist palace. A wooden shelf was placed on one wall of the room. The shelf was filled with jade slips. Elder Sun thought for a moment, then said, "From what I remember, Li Qing came to the Fulu school 11 years ago. She was only 9 years old at that time. I found the file of the disciples from 11 years ago. It's here." He took a jade slip from the shelf. After injecting a strand of transcendence energy, the jade slip projected a ray of light, condensing into several lines of words in the air. Song Ming, 12 years old, male, from North Commandery County, Song Village, 2 parents, younger sister, almost 5 years old, Pei Chuan, 10 years old, male, from North Commandery Zhou County, Pei Clan, parents dead, Su Ren, 16 years old, male, from Yunzhong Commandery. The jade slip projected the information of the disciples that the Fulu school had recruited back then. The Fulu school did not recruit many disciples each year, and even fewer disciples were assigned to each sect. This year, Violet Cloud Peak had recruited a total of 10 disciples. The information in the jade slip was extremely detailed, recording each disciple's age, gender, place of origin, and family situation. Li Mu's gaze swept across, and finally, at the end, he saw a familiar name. Li Qing. Li Mu's gaze continued to move down, and his expression froze. Under her name, there were no other words. Other than her name, where she came from, and who else was in her family, there was nothing. Elder Su also noticed the abnormality. Looking at Elder Sun, he asked, "What's going on?" Elder Sun scratched his head, also somewhat puzzled. Logically speaking, such a situation should not have occurred unless she did not enter the sect through the normal method. As for the specific method, I'm afraid only the elder who guided her into the sect back then would know. There was no record in Li Qing's file. Elder Sun asked the other elders, but none of them knew. In the past 10 years, the positions of the elders of the various peaks had changed, and some had even died due to unknown reasons. To find the elder who guided Li Qing into the sect back then would probably require the full power of the Fulu school. This trip could be considered a fruitless one. As they flew out of Violet Cloud Peak, Elder Su said to Li Mu, "Lord Li, don't worry. I will help you keep an eye on this matter. If there is any news, I will inform you immediately." Li Mu clasped his hands together and said, "Thank you, Elder Su." Elder Su smiled and said, "It's no trouble at all." Li Mu's gaze inadvertently looked down, and he saw that the mountain path below was densely packed with people. Waves of mana could be faintly felt, and he asked curiously, "Why are there so many cultivators down there?" Elder Su explained, "In 5 days, it will be the Talisman Dao trial that is held once every 4 years. During each trial, the various peaks will choose a few seedlings who are adept at the Talisman Dao from these cultivators and accept them as disciples." For a large sect like the Fulu school, the legacy of the sect was extremely important. Li Mu had seen this before. They sent people to the various government offices, and through the household register, they found various talents with special constitutions. After accepting them as disciples, they nurtured them from a young age. Compared to that method, accepting disciples through the trial was obviously less costly and more effective. The 6 schools and 4 sects were the blessed lands in the hearts of all cultivators. Joining these sects meant that one could use the resources of the sect and receive the guidance of the sect's experts. Therefore, cultivators flocked to these sections. At this moment, Li Mu saw no less than 100 people below. Elder Su looked down and said with some pride, "Thousands of people participate in each trial of our sect. The final winner will receive a talisman. With this talisman, one can directly become a core disciple of our sect." As he spoke, he suddenly slapped his head and said, "I remember now. No wonder the name Li Qing sounds familiar to me. 11 years ago, someone used a talisman to exchange for her opportunity to enter the sect. I was the one who personally handled it. Li Mu raised his eyebrows and asked, "The talisman can be used by others?" Elder Su nodded and said, "It can. However, if the talisman is not used by the trial champion but is only given to someone else, then the person who enters the sect through the talisman can only be an ordinary disciple." Li Mu thought for a moment and asked, "Can I participate in the Fulu trial?" Elder Su was stunned for a moment and nodded. "You can. As long as you are a cultivator under the age of 30, you can participate in the trial." He sized up Li Mu and asked, "But does Lord Li know anything about Fulu?" Li Mu nodded and said, "I know a little." Chapter 328. Elder Su looked at Li Mu. Seeing that he was serious, he could only say, "If Lord Li wants to try, I will arrange it for you after I return to the main peak." There was something he did not say out loud for the sake of his face. If he only had a slight understanding of the Fulu Dao, he might not even be able to pass the first stage of the trial. Every 4 years, the ancestral court held a trial of the Dao of Talismans. This trial also had the purpose of selecting the best disciples. During each trial, there would be thousands or even tens of thousands of cultivators coming from all over the Great Zhou and even other countries. These cultivators all wanted to join the Fulu school and become a disciple of a large sect. They wanted to embark on a broader path of cultivation. The people who participated in the trial traveled a long way. Every one of them had some confidence in their Fulu Dao. Even so, less than 1 out of 100 people could pass the trial in the end. Those who could last until the end were all true masters of the Fulu Dao. Every path of cultivation was very difficult. A cultivator could only be proficient in one path. A cultivator who was proficient in the Fulu Dao would find it difficult to invest a lot of time in divine arts, alchemy, artifact forging, formation, and martial Dao. They would not have deep attainments in these areas. In Elder Su's eyes, Li Mu's attainments in divine arts had clearly reached the peak. He was among the top geniuses. If such a person was also proficient in the Fulu Dao, the heavens would be too unfair. He originally wanted to remind Li Mu that if he only had a slight understanding of the Fulu Dao, there was no need for him to participate in the trial of the Dao of Talismans. After thinking about it, he felt that this would hurt his pride too much. It would be better to let him hit a wall once. He would know how much he was worth in the Fulu Dao. After parting with Elder Su, Li Mu flew towards White Cloud Peak. This trip to Purple Cloud Peak was not without any gains. He found out through Elder Sun's investigation that Li Qing had entered the Fulu school 11 years ago and had entered the sect through special channels. Someone had wasted the opportunity to become a core disciple of the Fulu school and used a talisman to send her into the Fulu school. Originally, the jade slip should have recorded the information of the disciples who had entered the sect in detail. Why did it only have her name? What was her identity? What was she carrying? Why did she suddenly leave Fulu school? Li Mu's heart was filled with one mystery after another. He had no way of knowing all these, but he could confirm that Li Qing must have met with something, and it must be something grave, something that could endanger her life. Li Mu's heart was burning with anxiety, but he had nowhere to go and was powerless to do anything. Suddenly, he seemed to have thought of something, and a ray of light appeared in his mind. Just now, he was so worried that he actually forgot an important point. As long as he could find the original owner of that talisman, wouldn't he be able to figure out what had happened to Li Qing? The Dao of Talismans trial was only held once every 4 years, and the person that obtained the first every year would surely be the center of attention. It was difficult to find Li Qing, but wasn't it easy to find him? Li Mu flew back to the main peak. This time, he did not ask Dao Zhong to invite Elder Su, but paid a visit in person. After only a quarter of an hour, he saw Li Mu again. Elder Su asked in surprise, "Lord Li, is there anything else?" Li Mu went straight to the point and asked, "Elder Su must have an impression of the first person in each Dao of Talismans trial, right?" "Of course." Taoist priest Su Chang said, 4 years ago, the first person in the Dao of Talismans trial is now a core disciple of the main peak. 2 years ago, he stepped into Dongxian. 8 years ago, the first person in the Dao of Talismans trial did not stay in the ancestral court, but he established a branch of the Fulu school. 12 years ago, that person from 12 years ago used his talisman in exchange for Li Qing's opportunity to enter the sect. Li Mu hurriedly asked, "Who was that person from 12 years ago?" Elder Su shook his head and said, "Because he didn't stay in the ancestral court, nor did he join the Fulu school. I don't remember his information. Lord Li, please wait a moment, I'll check for you." He walked out of the Taoist palace, and after a while he came back and said, "I found it. That person's name is Li Er. 12 years ago he only left this name. Li Er, Li Qing. Could Li Qing be his daughter? However, the name Li Er should be just a pseudonym. No one would have such a strange name." Li Mu said seriously, "This matter is very important to me. I want to know the ins and outs of what happened back then. I'll have to trouble Elder Su." Elder Su had never seen Li Mu so serious. After thinking for a while, he said, "I'll check who was in charge of the Talisman Dao trial back then. He should know more than me." He walked into the Taoist palace and came out a moment later. He took out a Fulu, transmitted a few words to the Fulu, and threw the Fulu into the air. The talisman turned into a paper crane and flew out of the Taoist palace. Not long after, an old woman flew in from the outside. After the old woman came in, she asked directly, "Senior Brother Su, why are you looking for me?" Elder Su looked at the old woman and asked, "Junior Sister Chen, I remember that you were in charge of the Talisman Dao trial 12 years ago. Do you still remember the first place of the trial?" The old woman was stunned and said, "Why do you suddenly ask this?" Taoist priest Su Chang said, "Don't ask this first. Do you still remember that person?" The old woman said, "Of course. That person is called Li Er. I remember that 13 years ago, he wanted to send a little girl to our Fulu school. However, that little girl's aptitude was not outstanding, so we didn't agree at that time." Elder Su said in surprise, "There's such a thing?" The old woman nodded and said, "Later, he asked me what would make the ancestral court willing to accept that little girl. I told him that as long as the little girl could enter the top 30 in the Talisman Dao trial, or if he could win the Talisman Dao trial, she could enter the ancestral court." Elder Su asked, "What happened after that?" The old woman continued, "That little girl didn't cultivate and didn't even have the qualifications to participate in the Talisman Dao trial. However, Li Er left without saying a word after hearing it. Half a year later, he actually came to participate in the trial and passed several stages in a row. He took the first place in one fell swoop and used that talisman to exchange for the little girl's chance to enter the ancestral court. I remember that she went to the Violet Cloud Peak later. After 12 years, when she talked about Li Er, her face was still full of admiration. She said, "That person really has great perseverance. Half a year ago, he didn't know the Tao of Fulu at all, but he still borrowed a talisman book from me. I pitied him, so I passed on some of my knowledge of talisman books to him. Who knew that half a year later, his attainments in the Talisman Dao would advance by leaps and bounds. He was actually not inferior to the elders who had been immersed in the Talisman Dao for many years. He suppressed thousands of Talisman Dao experts and won the first place in the trial in one fell swoop. In fact, at that time, the sect masters specially allowed him to become a core disciple of the ancestral court in addition to that little girl, but he refused." The old woman sighed and said, 12 years ago, if he was willing to stay in the Fulu school, with his perseverance and talent, I'm afraid our sect would have another head elder." "What a pity," Li Mu asked hopefully. "Senior, do you know where Li Er went?" The old woman shook her head and said, "Since the little girl was sent to the Fulu school 11 years ago, he has never appeared again." Li Mu didn't give up and continued to ask, "What does Li Er look like?" The old woman waved her hand and a picture appeared in front of Li Mu. The man in the picture was wearing a gray robe and a bamboo hat on his head. A black cloth hung down the edge of the bamboo hat, completely covering his appearance. Li Mu sighed. The only remaining clue of the Fulu school was broken just like that. When he returned to White Cloud Peak, Hanja and junior sister Qin had already left. Before Li Mu left, he changed his wine. With Hanja's alcohol tolerance, he would get drunk after a few cups. He didn't know if junior sister Qin would be able to seize the opportunity. Li Mu wasn't in the mood to worry about Hanja. He was only thinking about Li Qing. A year ago, when Li Mu was by her side, he was only a small bailiff and couldn't help her much. Now, he already had the ability to protect her, but he couldn't find her. Fate often played with people like this. When she made the decision to leave the Fulu school, she must have been in a lot of pain. Therefore, Li Mu was determined to obtain the talisman tablet for the talisman Dao trial this time. This matter was outside of his original plan. Li Mu thought about it and decided to inform the Empress. Li Mu took out the conch. After activating it with his magic power, he asked softly, "Your Majesty, are you busy?" Soon, the Empress's voice came from the conch. "Are you coming back?" Li Mu coughed softly and said awkwardly, "No, I might have to wait for a few more days to return to the divine capital. In a few days, it will be the Fulu School's Talisman Dao trial. I plan to participate in this trial." Talisman Dao trial? Within the conch, the Empress's voice paused, and then she asked, "Isn't the Talisman Dao trial set up by the Talisman sect for the sake of selecting disciples? You promised me that you wouldn't join the Talisman sect." Li Mu quickly explained, "It's not like what your Majesty thinks." "Your Majesty, please listen to my explanation." Li Mu felt strange talking to the Empress like this. It was as if their identities were reversed. Then he realized that this was the identity he should have. He could finally talk to the Empress with this normal identity. The Empress was silent for a moment and said, "You can explain." Li Mu thought for a moment and said, "I think that the Great Zhou is now troubled by both internal and external problems. The new party, the old party, and the academy are not on the same side as your Majesty. The only inner guard who is loyal to your Majesty is too weak. There seem to be many officials in the court, but your Majesty is the only one who is struggling. If the Fulu school can support your Majesty, you won't have to work so hard." In the Changel Palace, Zhou Yi felt a trace of warmth in her heart. Even her gaze softened. She said softly, "These sects have always been detached from the world. No matter the rise or fall of the dynasty, they can't interfere with the court." Li Mu said, "I can first become a disciple of the Fulu school and then cultivate slowly. If I have a chance to enter the sixth realm, I can become a peak chief and have a certain say in the Fulu school. If I have a chance to enter the seventh realm, I have a chance to become the headmaster of the Fulu school. At that time, I and the entire Fulu school will be your Majesty's solid backing." Outside the small building, Elder Su was holding a trial letter and had one foot in the yard. When he heard Li Mu's words, embarrassment appeared on his face. He didn't know whether to enter or leave. Li Mu also noticed the abnormality behind him. When he turned around and met Elder Su's eyes, his expression gradually became awkward. Chapter 329. Li Mu looked at Elder Su, and Elder Su also looked at him. The situation was very awkward. In the end, it was Elder Su who broke the awkwardness. He coughed lightly and walked into the courtyard. He said, "I have brought Lord Li's trial letter." Since he did not mention what happened just now, Li Mu naturally would not mention it either. He accepted the trial letter and said, "Thank you, Elder Su." Taoist priest Su Chang said, "In 5 days, when the trial begins, I will inform Lord Li again." Li Mu nodded and said, "Okay." Elder Su cupped his hands and said, "I will take my leave first." Li Mu cupped his hands and returned the greeting. "Take care, Elder Su." After a polite exchange, Elder Su turned and left. In the spiritual snail, the Empress thought for a while and said, "Why don't you capture him and I will teach you how to erase his memory?" Li Mu hurriedly said, "No need, no need." Li Mu represented the Empress in the cooperation with the Fulu school. He could sit down and talk with the Fulu school's headmaster. There was no need to erase Elder Su's memory. Moreover, no one would believe him if he said that he wanted to become the headmaster of the Fulu school with just a little theurgy. In fact, Elder Su, who walked out of the small hut, really scoffed at Li Mu's words just now. To become the headmaster of the Fulu school, he first had to become a core disciple of the Fulu school. Just this alone was enough to completely block him out. The fastest way to become a core disciple of the Fulu school was to participate in the trial of the Tao of Talismans. He had to defeat thousands of cultivators who were proficient in the Tao of Talismans and win first place in the trial. This was only the first step of his plan. The second step was to cultivate hard and break through to the creation realm. Only then could he become an elder. The third step was to break through to the Dongxin realm from the creation realm. Only then could he become the headmaster. It was easy to go from divine ability to creation. At most, it would take a few decades. Once the magic power was enough, success would follow naturally. However, when the creation realm came to Dongxian, what was tested was one's talent and comprehension. The Fulu school had more than 100 creation elders, but only a few first seats. As for the fourth step, becoming the sect master, he still had to break through to the seventh realm and wait for the current sect master to abdicate before he could succeed the position of sect master. Even if there was such a day, it would be decades or centuries later. By then, the great Zhou might have had several emperors. Elder Su just smiled lightly before tossing this matter to the back of his mind, and then he flew towards the main peak. The Tao of Talismans trial this time was presided over by him, and he still had many things to do. Inside the small building, the Empress was silent for a while, then said, "I'm sorry, I misunderstood you just now." Although Li Mu was disappointed by the Empress's lack of trust, he did not show it. He said, "It is okay. I can understand, Your Majesty." As a man, he should be more magnanimous. If he was petty and got angry with the Empress, wouldn't he be like some unreasonable woman? Li Mu tried not to let himself be in the position of a barbaric boyfriend. He was already so magnanimous. He wouldn't have those strange dreams of lying in the Empress's arms at night, right? The next morning, Li Mu sat up from the bed with an expression of doubt on his face. Last night he was not in the Empress's arms. But the Empress was in his arms. These days, the number of times he dreamed of the Empress was more than the number of times he dreamed of Lu Hanyan. It must be because they talked too often. Li Si said that between men and women, only by maintaining a distance could there be pure friendship. Once the contact became frequent or the distance between them became close, the pure feelings would often become no longer pure. Li Mu decided to reduce the frequency of contact with the Empress, from once a day to once every 2 days. Now that he was far away in the North County, the Empress could not see him. When he returned to Chengdu, if he had such strange dreams again and was caught by the Empress, Li Mu could not even imagine the consequences. There were still a few days before the trial. He borrowed a few talisman books from Elder Su and prepared to make a breakthrough. Although Li Mu had already thoroughly grasped nearly 100 types of basic talismans in the past half a month, among the thousands of cultivators that had participated in the trial, besides a small portion that had come to make up the numbers and gain experience, all of them had absolute confidence in their own Tao of Talismans, so Li Mu had no choice but to treat his opponent as a human. 5 days later, on Mount Baiyun, the Talisman Tao trial that was held once every 4 years was about to begin. The Talisman Tao trial was not only a big deal for Mount Baiyun, but also for the entire North County and the surrounding counties. Before and after the Talisman Tao trial, thousands of cultivators gathered near Mount Baiyun. The demons around the North County had to stay in their nests obediently to avoid unexpected disasters. During this period, even demons and ghosts who had not done anything evil could be killed by the cultivators. The Fulu school's Talisman Tao trial was even crueler than the Great Zhou Court's imperial examinations. The imperial examinations selected 100 out of thousands of people. The Talisman Tao trial often had tens of thousands of participants, but in the end, only less than 50 people could pass the trial. It was difficult to select 1 out of 100 people. Even so, there were still countless cultivators who took part in the trial. There was no other reason. He snorted coldly and strode into the cliff. Stepping on the white cloud, he safely walked to the other side. The young man's eyes widened. He wondered if the cliff really judged one's bone age. He tentatively took a step forward and after letting out a scream, he fell straight down. These shrill cries caused some people to completely panic, and they didn't dare take another step forward. They turned back along the path they came from with dejection. Li Mu took a step forward and stepped on the white cloud. It was as if he had stepped on solid ground. He easily walked to the other side of the cliff. When he reached the other side, Li Mu realized that this was a huge platform. The platform covered an unknown amount of land. He could not see the end of it. It was as if someone had used great magic to flatten the entire mountain from the mountainside and carve out a platform. On the platform, there were countless stone platforms that were half the height of a person. On the stone platforms, there were writing brushes, yellow paper, cinnabar, and other items. Li Mu walked to the front and found a stone platform. He stood behind the stone platform. The cultivators who passed the cliff quickly found a stone platform and stood still. They were ready to take the first stage of the Talisman Dao trial. At first, there were more than 6,000 people who had a trial letter. Among them, there were only about 100 people who were over the age and wanted to take advantage of the situation. They had already been eliminated at the cliff. There were still nearly 6,000 people who participated in the first stage of the trial. After everyone who passed the cliff found a stone platform and stood still, 3 shining golden words suddenly appeared in the sky in front of the platform. Exorcism Talisman. There was no explanation for this stage. However, from the words in the sky and the items on the stone platforms, it was not difficult to guess that the first stage of the trial was for everyone to draw an exorcism talisman. The exorcism talisman was a yellow-grade fulu. It was also one of the most basic fulu. It had many uses. When ordinary people carried it on their bodies, low-level ghosts and monsters would not dare to come close. When the exorcism talisman was turned into talisman water and drank it could cure common colds and various diseases. Almost all cultivators who had learned fulu knew how to draw an exorcism talisman. For many people, this was the first fulu that they had learned. Fulu school was quite friendly to these cultivators. They did not make things difficult for them in the first stage. However, this did not mean that this stage was not difficult at all. There were only 3 sheets of yellow paper on the stone platform. The amount of cinnabar was only enough to draw 3 fulu. There was an incense stick on the stone platform. At a certain moment, it lit itself. This meant that all the cultivators had to successfully draw an exorcism talisman within the time it took for an incense stick to burn. Moreover, they only had 3 chances. After failing 3 times, they would not have the materials to draw a talisman, cultivators being able to draw a fulu and cultivators being able to draw a fulu in one try were 2 completely different concepts. Some people could draw an exorcism talisman, but they had to fail multiple times and waste many sets of materials before succeeding. Such a person could not be considered to have fulu talent. White Cloud Mountain. Main peak. There was a huge screen in the sky above the square. On the screen was the situation on the platform. The elders chatted and laughed as they watched the situation on the screen. How long do you think it will take for these people to successfully draw an exorcism talisman? Those who pass will be able to draw it in half an incense stick's time. After that, even if they can draw it, they will not be able to pass the subsequent trials. I remember that in the past trials, the fastest person to draw this talisman took 20 breaths. It was 12 years ago, right? I still remember that Li Er. He was a true talisman Dao genius. 20 breaths. Many elders in the sect can't do it that fast. As the elders were discussing, a beam of light suddenly lit up on the screen. The square fell silent for a moment before an uproar broke out. Someone finished drawing so quickly? How many breaths have passed this time? Less than 10 breaths. That's way too fast. How is that possible? Could there be a 6th realm cultivator among the cultivators? Is that a senior joking? Everyone looked at the screen, which quickly zoomed in on a certain spot on the platform. The elders widened their eyes, wanting to see who could draw an exorcism talisman in such a short time. However, all they saw was a cloud of fog. Everyone could not help but be stunned. What's going on? Why is there fog on the trial platform? Who can go and see what's happening on the trial platform? Someone reacted quickly and said, "That's not fog on the trial platform. He has a Dharma treasure on him that conceals heavenly secrets." Elder Su stood up abruptly with a stunned expression. "It's him." Chapter 330. On the main peak square, the group of elders looked at the figure shrouded in clouds on the trial platform through the image above, their faces filled with shock. Although the exorcism talisman was the most basic fulu, even they would need 10 or even 20 breaths to complete it. The success of the talisman was mainly related to two factors. First, whether or not the talisman could be drawn in one go. Second, whether or not the talisman was stable in the process of drawing. It was not easy to draw the fulu in one go without any ripples in the talisman. One had to ensure the calmness of the heart. If the talisman was slightly impatient, the talisman would be wrong, or the talisman would be too unstable, and the talisman would fail. If the talisman failed, not only would it waste time and energy, it would also waste precious materials. Therefore, in the process of talisman drawing, cultivators would try their best to remain calm and write at a steady pace, ensuring that the talisman was complete and the talisman was stable. Naturally, the talisman drawing speed would not be too fast. To be able to draw the exorcism talisman in 10 breaths, one had to have a high level of cultivation, and one's control of the body and the talisman had reached the peak. Or one had practiced the exorcism talisman for tens of thousands of times. Even if one was in the soul refining stage, they would still be able to draw the talisman quickly and accurately. But generally speaking, no one would spend so much time and energy on a low-level fulu. Regardless of the reason, the fact that this person could complete the first stage of the trial in 10 breaths was enough to attract their attention. Unfortunately, this person was shrouded in clouds, preventing them from seeing his true appearance. One of the main peak elders looked at Elder Su and asked, "Senior Su, this person, could it be?" Elder Su had already come back to his senses. He nodded and said, "Other than him, who else could it be?" On the trial platform, Li Mu finished the last stroke of the exorcism talisman. The stone platform in front of him suddenly lit up. Beside him, a cultivator who was at the critical moment of drawing the talisman was shocked by this abnormality. His hand trembled, and the talisman was crooked. The first talisman paper was ruined. The cultivator looked down at the ruined talisman paper and blurted out, "Motherf asterisk cur." The stone platform lit up, indicating that the person beside him had successfully completed the fulu. After that person cursed in his heart, he looked at the young man behind the stone platform with a shocked expression and said in his heart, "How could he be so fast?" He looked at the burning incense in front of the stone platform and didn't dare to think any further. He had already wasted a chance and only had 2 talisman papers left. If he couldn't draw an exorcism talisman before the incense burned out, he would be eliminated in the first stage of the trial. He looked at the man one last time and thought to himself, "I hope you can be as fast in bed." Dozens of breaths after Li Mu drew the exorcism talisman, a faint light began to shine from the trial platform. He looked around. A small number of people had already completed their exorcism talismans, but most of them were still immersed in drawing. Fulu School's first trial was quite interesting. What they tested was the most common fulu, but the testing method was not ordinary. 1 incense stick and 3 talisman papers. Not only did it require the success rate of the talisman writing, it also required the speed of the talisman writing. For a cultivator who practiced the Tao of Fulu, the success rate of the talisman writing was extremely important. This point was not reflected in low-level Fulu. If the success rate was slightly lower, at most some yellow paper and cinnabar would be wasted. But for high-level Fulu, the talisman papers and talisman writing materials were extremely precious and could not be wasted. If one failed a few times, they might have to gather materials again. Li Mu stood behind the stone platform and waited until the last incense stick on the stone platform burned to ashes. "Wait, I'm just short of 1. Give me another 10 breaths. Give me a chance." The cultivators who had not yet succeeded in drawing talismans all spoke out anxiously. But the stone platform beside them suddenly burst out with a burst of light and swept them away from the trial platform. The stone platform in front of the cultivators who passed the first stage emitted a faint light, and they continued to stay on the trial platform. Li Mu looked around again and found that after the first stage, the number of cultivators on the stone platform had decreased by nearly half. An ordinary exorcism talisman was also able to distinguish so many cultivators. After the bell rang, Elder Sue's voice rang in everyone's ears. Those who can draw 10 exorcism talismans within an hour can enter the third stage of the trial. As his voice fell, countless yellow papers and cinnabar flew in from outside the platform and landed on the remaining stone platforms. Li Mu counted the yellow papers on the stone platform in front of him. There were exactly 10 of them. This meant that if one wanted to pass the second stage, he had to ensure a 100% success rate and complete it within an hour. If the difficulty of the first stage was 1, then the difficulty of the second stage was 100. Within the time it took for an incense stick to burn, there were 3 chances to draw an exorcism talisman. If one had some attainments in the Tao of Talismans, they could do it. But to ensure that one could draw 10 talismans without making a single mistake was not something a beginner in the Tao of Talismans could do. He had to truly and completely master the exorcism talisman, and not rely on luck to draw talismans. If one made a single mistake out of 10 times, all previous efforts would be wasted. This was not only a test of their Tao of Talismans, but also their mental fortitude. Those who could maintain their calm under such pressure and successfully draw talismans were the talents that the Fulu school wanted. Of course, it wasn't difficult for Li Mu to discern from these 2 trials that even if the talisman sect was wealthy and overbearing, it wasn't willing to waste resources. So, the cultivators that didn't have a high success rate in drawing talismans would be completely eliminated during the first 2 trials. Li Mu picked up his brush and began to draw talismans. On the main peak square, a group of elders and many disciples of the Fulu school were watching the live broadcast of the trial. This stage won't be easy for them. It's not just them. Some disciples of other sects may not be able to draw 10 Fulu talismans without making a single mistake. 12 years ago, that person only took 15 minutes. He was the fastest person to complete the second stage of the trial in all of history. I wonder if there will be any surprises this year. While the crowd was chatting, it didn't take long for another ray of light to appear on the screen. This time, not only the elders, but even the spectating disciples in the square let out a cry of surprise. It's fake, right? Not even 15 minutes? This person can't be an octopus demon, right? Although the exorcism talisman is very simple, drawing 10 of them can't be that fast. On the square, the image zoomed in, and a blurry figure appeared in front of them again. In the next moment, someone exclaimed, "It's him again!" I know, he must know that the first 2 stages of the trial tested the basics of the Fulu. He deliberately practiced it. Give me a year and a half, and if I only practiced the exorcism talisman, I could be faster than him. But if he does this, he will be eliminated in the 3rd stage, not to mention the 4th stage. On the square, after a moment of surprise, all the disciples calmed down. It was only an exorcism talisman, and no matter how skilled one was in cultivating it, it was of no great use. At most, one could be a wandering physician in the mortal world or sell protective talismans to deceive mortals. It was impossible to rely on an exorcism talisman to pass the trial in the talisman Tao of the talisman sect's ancestral court. Most of the disciples didn't have a high evaluation of this person's attainments in the Tao of Talismans. There were only 2 possibilities for him to be able to draw the exorcism talisman so skillfully. First, his dermic energy was very strong, and it was at least at the 6th level. But how could a 6th level expert participate in the trial of the Tao of Talismans? So this possibility was directly eliminated. Second, his cultivation wasn't high, but he spent a large amount of time practicing the exorcism talisman. Practice makes perfect, and after practicing thousands of times, he could still draw it so skillfully and accurately. But such actions were meaningless. The exorcism talisman was useful to mortals, but it was useless to cultivators. A cultivator with a normal mind wouldn't waste time on it. Maybe this person just wanted to attract everyone's attention in the first 2 stages of the trial. However, the elders in front didn't think so. One of the elders looked at Elder Su and asked, "Senior Su, what do you think?" Elder Su recalled the scene just now and said, "His movements of drawing the exorcism talisman were smooth, and he succeeded in drawing the exorcism talisman in one go." This means that his dermic energy is very stable. There were no gaps between the 10 Fulu talismans, which means that he had a card up his sleeve. If it was him, he definitely wouldn't just be proficient in the exorcism talisman. That elder looked at the fog in the image and said, his basic skills are very solid, and it's rare among the core disciples. I just don't know if he can pass the third stage. The next stage is testing talent and not basic skills. It was exceptionally quiet on the trial platform. After Li Mu finished drawing the 10 exorcism talismans, he observed the surrounding cultivators. It was quiet all around, and no strange sounds could be heard. The first 2 stages of the Fulu School's assessment were unusually fair. They didn't differentiate the cultivators based on their cultivation level. They tested the low-grade yellow-level exorcism talisman, the most basic Fulu talisman. Whether it was Dongxian or soul-refining cultivators, they all knew how to draw. No matter how high a grotto profound expert's magic power was, they could only obtain 100 points at most under the situation that the full score was only 100. As for soul-refining cultivators, although their strength was low, as long as they worked hard and performed exceptionally, they could also get the same number of points. Of course, for low-level cultivators, it was definitely more difficult to pass the trial. They were allowed to make mistakes in the first stage, but in the second stage, they couldn't make even the slightest mistake. For this reason, almost all of the cultivators temporarily shut off their hearing to avoid being disturbed by the outside world when they were drawing the exorcism talisman. Sometimes, there would be a mistake, and after a sigh, they would be silently taken away by the stone platform. As time passed, the number of cultivators on the trial platform decreased. In this trial, they couldn't rush it, but they couldn't be unhurried either. Drawing the exorcism talisman required a calm mind. Once rushed, it was easy to make a mistake, and one mistake would waste all of their previous efforts. Furthermore, there was a time limit for this stage. Chapter 331. The third round of the Talisman Dao trial had begun. Several golden runes appeared in the sky in front of the trial platform. These runes formed a Fulu. The moment he saw the rune, Li Mu had some doubts in his heart, because he had never seen this Fulu before. Li Mu had already learned all the basic Fulu during his time at Fulu school. He was sure that this Fulu was not any type that he had seen before. The other trial takers on the other platforms also had stunned expressions on their faces. What rune is this? Why have I never seen it before? How do you draw a Fulu that you have never seen before? At this moment, Elder Su's voice was heard. Those who successfully draw this rune within 4 hours will pass the third round and enter the final round of the trial. Countless talisman papers and cinnabar flew in from outside the platform. This time, there were 100 talisman papers. The Talisman Dao trial this time seemed to be different from the previous ones. Li Mu looked up at the golden runes above and somewhat understood the Fulu school's purpose. The first 2 rounds tested the trial taker's basic skills. The third round tested the trial taker's talent. Those common Fulu, even those without talent, could be drawn skillfully after thousands of practice over a long period of time. Passing the first 2 rounds only meant that they had a solid foundation in the exorcism talisman. It did not mean anything. But for a new Fulu, the result was different. Those with outstanding talent in the Talisman Dao might be able to grasp it in a few hours. Those with average talent would need a few days, or even 10 days to half a month. This Fulu was not in the talisman books that Li Mu had seen before. It should be a new Fulu created by the Fulu school. He had never seen a Fulu before. He did not know the order of writing the runes or the strength of his dermic powers when writing the runes. He had to test them one by one. Li Mu picked up the brush and dipped it in cinnabar. He closed his eyes and pondered for a while before starting to write. He finished drawing the runes in one go, but his magic power was not sealed in the rune paper. This meant that he had failed. I can't inject my magic power. The order of the runes is wrong. Li Mu thought for a moment and picked up the brush again. He changed the order of writing the runes, but he still couldn't seal the magic power. Li Mu lowered his head and looked at the ruined talisman paper. He thought to himself, during the last 2 strokes, the mana leaked out. It's because the mana input was too strong and exceeded the upper limit of this talisman. Again, on the square of the main peak, an elder who had been staring at Li Mu said, "He has already failed twice." Another elder Taoist priest said, "It's normal. A new Fulu, even if you and I have it in our hands, we can't succeed in one try. We have to try many times." However, this talisman is not complicated. If he really has talent in the talisman Dao, 4 hours is enough. After 4 hours, even if he succeeds, his future achievements will be limited. He looked at Elder Su and asked, "Senior Su, do you think he can succeed?" Elder Su shook his head and said, "I don't know. However, if he really wins this trial, there will be a big problem." At this moment, if he still didn't know that Li Mu's a little and his understanding of the a little were not the same, he would not be qualified to be an elder of the main peak. From the first 2 trials, Li Mu's performance showed that he was definitely not a talisman Dao newbie. And in the 3rd trial, he only failed twice and found the correct order of writing the runes. As long as he tried a few more times, he would be able to find the limit of his dermic powers and successfully write the runes. In this way, he could immediately enter the 4th trial, which was also the last trial. This seemed to be getting closer to his plan of seizing power in the Fulu school. At that time, Elder Su only thought that it was an unrealistic joke. It was not until he saw Li Mu overcome all obstacles in the Talisman Dao trial that a sense of crisis arose in his heart. He couldn't be serious, could he? Just as this concern arose in Elder Su's heart, on the screen above his head, a ray of light swept across. The main peak square was in an uproar. It appeared. Who is so fast? This is the new Fulu that was just designed by the headmaster. No one can know in advance. I can't see his face clearly. Why is it a cloud of fog? Isn't this the person who was the fastest in the 1st and 2nd trials? Li Mu could not hear the discussions of the people in the main peak square. In his 7th trial, he finally succeeded in sealing his dermic powers into the talisman paper and drew the nameless Fulu. Under extreme calmness and without any fluctuations in his heart, drawing talismans was simply successful. He already had some doubts in his heart that in the other world, the art of tranquility did not exist for the purpose of drawing talismans. The moment he finished drawing the Fulu and put down the brush, the stone platform beside him rolled him up and flew off the platform, landing on another mountain peak. The stone platform put him down and returned along the original path. Elder Su stood on the mountain peak and looked at Li Mu with a complicated expression. He cupped his hands and said, "Congratulations, Lord Li, for being the first to complete the first 3 trials." Li Mu cupped his hands and returned the greeting. He said politely, "I was lucky. He looked at Elder Su and asked, "What is the 4th trial?" Elder Su pointed to the front and said, "This is the 4th trial." Li Mu looked in the direction that he pointed and saw rows of stone steps that extended into the depths of the clouds. Taoist priest Su Chang said, "This 4th trial is both a test for the trial taker and also a creation for the trial taker. As for how much you can benefit from this trial, it depends on the strength of each trial taker," Li Mu said uncertainly. "Creation." Taoist priest Su Chang said, "You will know when you walk up the stone steps." Li Mu stepped onto the first stone step, and the scenery in front of him suddenly changed. He appeared in a strange world, and when he looked around, all he saw was a vast expanse of whiteness. There was only a table in front of him, and on the table was a piece of paper, a brush, and cinnabar. A familiar Fulu floated in front of the table. It was another exorcism talisman. Clearly, this was another trial for him to draw talismans. Li Mu was about to vomit from drawing exorcism talismans today, but he could only hold back his disgust. He picked up the brush and finished drawing an exorcism talisman in a few breaths. The scenery in front of him disappeared and he returned to the steps again. Li Mu walked to the next step and appeared in the vast expanse of whiteness again. This time, a brand new Fulu appeared in front of him. Demons Seeking Talisman. Every step here seemed to correspond to a Fulu. Li Mu finished drawing the Demons Seeking Talisman. When he walked to the 3rd step, what he saw was the Soul Fixation Talisman. As he guessed, The first trial tested one's basic skills, the third trial tested one's talent, and the fourth trial tested one's basic skills and talent together. There was only one chance for each step. He had to be careful with every step. If he made a mistake in drawing the Fulu, the Talisman Dao trial would end here. Even Li Mu did not dare to be careless. He treated the Fulu of each step very seriously. When Li Mu walked to the 10th step, many people had passed the third trial and landed at the foot of the mountain. Some people walked up the steps. After a few steps, their bodies would be teleported out and they would stand at the side with a disappointed expression. Even a Talisman Dao expert could not guarantee that he would succeed every time. No matter how careful he was, he still made a mistake on the 6th Fulu. The 4th trial was really too difficult. However, he did not completely give up because others might not do better than him. He still had a chance. He stood at the foot of the mountain and looked at the figure who had walked up more than a dozen steps. A deep sense of powerlessness arose in his heart. Before coming to the Fulu school, he thought that he was a Talisman Dao genius. After passing 3 trials in a row, his confidence soared. He thought that if he worked hard, he might have a chance to become a core disciple. However, he suffered a huge blow when he just entered the 4th trial. The figure on the stone steps of the mountain path made him deeply understand the gap between people. Time slowly passed and more people passed the 3rd stage. 4 hours later, the trial takers who had yet to fully comprehend the talisman on the trial platform had lost their chance to pass the 3rd stage. At this time, there were less than 100 people at the foot of the mountain. The 3rd trial eliminated 90% of the trial takers. Out of the 6,000 people, only 3 trials left 2 digits. Among these people, there were dozens of people who would be eliminated in the 4th trial. They had already learned the rules of the 4th trial from the trial takers who had participated in the 4th trial. They estimated in their hearts which step they could reach. Occasionally, they would look up at the figure at the front and secretly curse him as a monster. On the stone steps, Li Mu had already walked up the 43rd step. This meant that he had drawn 43 Fulu without missing a single detail. He stayed on this step for a full quarter of an hour and did not take another step forward. In the world of cultivation, the Fulu was divided into heaven, earth, Xian, and Huang. Each stage was further divided into upper, middle, and lower grades. There were a total of 4 stages and 12 grades. With Li Mu's current spiritual power, he could only draw a Xian upper grade Fulu. As for the earth lower grade Fulu, he would need to be at least at the 5th level of cultivation to draw one. The last Fulu he drew was a Xian upper grade. The next step would probably be an earth Fulu. With his current spiritual power, it was impossible to draw one. Li Mu looked back and realized that the people below had at most reached the 10th step. It was almost impossible for them to continue to reach the 30th step without making any mistakes. The current him had already won. However, Li Mu still wanted to try. At most, he would fail and be sent down the mountain. But before that, he needed to rest for a while to recover his spiritual power. After drawing more than 40 Fulu in a row, his spiritual power was about to be depleted. Even the donkey in the workshop would not dare to work so hard. If it was not for the fact that he was determined to get that talisman, he would have already given up on the 30th step. The higher the step, the more insurance. He sat cross-legged on the stone step and meditated to recover his spiritual power. After an unknown amount of time, Li Mu suddenly felt movement beside him. He opened his eyes and saw a young man walking to the 43rd step he was on. The young man glanced at him and said, "Hey, make way." Li Mu was shocked. This person was clearly also a cultivator participating in the trial. He actually also reached the 43rd step. Sure enough, he could not underestimate the heroes of the world. No one knew better than him how difficult it was to reach here from the first step. If not for the clear heart mantra, Li Mu would have stopped long ago. That person walked to the middle of the 43rd step and closed his eyes. After 10 breaths, he opened his eyes again. Li Mu narrowed his eyes. He was still standing here and was not sent down. This meant that he had already drawn the 43rd Fulu. That person did not even look at Li Mu and walked to the next step. After a while, he opened his eyes again and stepped onto the 45th step. On the square of the main peak, many disciples and elders had looks of disbelief on their faces. In the past, it was already a surprise to have someone reach the 20th step. This year, someone actually reached the 40th step, and there are two of them. Who's the one who caught up from behind? He looks so young. He took less time to reach each step than the first person. I wonder which step he will reach in the end? In the Tao Palace on the main peak, several first seats and the talisman puppet sect leader also had an image in front of them. The image depicted the situation on the stone steps. At this moment, Li Mu, whose entire body was covered in fog, stopped at the 43rd step. That young man had already reached the 47th step. Hyun Jinko looked at the figure at the front and said, "There's something wrong with this person." The Fulu school's first seat looked at the person at the front through the mystic light technique. A golden light flashed in his eyes as he shook his head and said, "Let's not bother about him for now." He looked at Li Mu with admiration and said, "It's Li Mu who really surprised me." Hyun Jinko nodded and said with a strange look in his eyes, "It's not just a surprise. It's simply unbelievable. If I could turn back time, I would kidnap him even if I had to. He has the hope of the Fulu school." Xingyangzi looked at the person at the front and said, "I wonder who is so bold to come to White Cloud Mountain and cause trouble. Won't this talisman Dao trial become a joke because of him?" The Fulu school's headmaster looked at Li Mu and said with a smile, "That might not be the case." On the 43rd step, Li Mu looked ahead, took a deep breath, and took a step forward. Chapter 332. Taking a step forward, Li Mu once again appeared in that vast white world. The moment he entered, Li Mu's gaze landed on the Fulu floating in front of the table. Then he sighed softly. This was a purple heaven thunder talisman. As he expected, from the 44th stone step onwards, he would have to write the earth-level Fulu. The purple heaven thunder talisman was the most common representation of the earth-level Fulu. The purple heaven thunder technique was a 5th-level abhijna. Li Mu could borrow the confrontation technique to release the purple heaven thunder, but with his own mana, he could not directly use it. The Fulu was nothing more than a ceiling of spells. Spells that he could not use naturally could not be made into talismans. Therefore, at present, he could not draw the purple heaven thunder talisman. The young man in front of him, although he looked like he only had spirit concentration, he must have hidden his cultivation level. However, this was also because his skills were not as good as others. There was nothing to complain about. If he could not pass the trial and get the talisman, he could only swallow his pride and see if he could get one from the Fulu school. Li Mu himself did not have much prestige in the Fulu school, but the Empress did. Using the tiger's skin to pull the banner was his strength. Li Mu cast away these distracting thoughts. Even though he knew it was impossible, he still had to try. If he failed, he would be transported to the lowest stone step like most people. He was about to pick up the talisman pen, but his hands suddenly stopped. The talisman pen on the table seemed to be different from the ones before. Before the 43rd step, he had used a normal talisman pen. The body of the pen was made of wood, and there were runes carved on it. This was to ensure that the cultivator's mana would not destroy the talisman pen when he was using the talisman. At this moment, the talisman pen in his hand seemed to be made of metal but not metal, wood but not wood. Holding it in his hand, it seemed to be weightless. More importantly, after holding the pen, Li Mu had an illusion that the mana in his body seemed to have broken through the bottleneck of the abhijna and reached the creation realm. He looked at the purple heaven thunder talisman again and saw that the talisman had disappeared. He started to draw again from the beginning. The order of the purple heaven thunder talisman was gradually imprinted in his mind. Li Mu stared blankly at the strange phenomenon in front of him. It was only now that he understood what Elder Su meant. The 4th stage was both a trial by fire and also good fortune. With Li Mu's own magic power, he could only reach the 43rd step. The reason why he couldn't move forward wasn't because of his talent or any other reason, but because his cultivation was limited. But from the first 3 trials, the Fulu school did not care about the cultivation of the trial takers. The first and second trials tested the most basic exorcism talisman. The third trial tested the Fulu. Although it was a new Fulu that he had never seen before, the dermic powers required to write it did not exceed the exorcism talisman. In the fourth trial, Li Mu wrote the Fulu. When he reached the limit of his own dermic powers, the rules of the trial seemed to change. He had never drawn the purple heaven thunder talisman before and did not know the order of the talisman. He also did not have the dermic powers to write the talisman. But in this trial, the Fulu school had given him everything he needed. All he had to do was control his dermic powers and write the talisman step by step. It was probably the same for the cultivators behind him. The Tao of Fulu. Writing the talisman was not difficult, and controlling the dermic powers was not difficult. The difficult part was to smoothly write the talisman while ensuring that the dermic powers of each talisman were stable. The transition of dermic powers between different talismans was a problem of multitasking. The higher the level of the Fulu, the more complex the talisman was. The more dermic powers changed, and the higher the probability of failure. At this time, the use of talent was revealed. Li Mu did not have much talent, but he had a cheat. He held the talisman brush and did not immediately start writing the talisman. Instead, he practiced dozens of times in the void and memorized the talisman characters of the purple heaven thunder talisman. Then, without using the talisman materials, he felt the process of the dermic powers changing as he wrote the talisman. He repeated this dozens of times before he looked at the talisman paper on the table. He lifted the brush and began to write slowly. At the main peak of Mount Baiyun, in the Tao Palace, Hyun Jinko closed his eyes. He also held a talisman brush in his hand. His wrist moved slowly in the void, but it did not seem to be of his own accord. In the art of dark light, Li Mu's body was still covered in a cloud of fog. But if one looked closely at the hand that extended out of the fog, one would realize that his hand and Hyun Jinko's hand moved in the same direction. After a while, Hyun Jinko opened his eyes and said, "The talisman is complete." The Fulu school recruited disciples not based on cultivation, but on talent. In the fourth stage, when the Fulu that the trial taker wrote exceeded the limits of his dermic powers, the peak masters would lend their dermic powers and insights to them. This was also a fortune that the Fulu school gave to the trial takers. They had worked hard to reach the fourth stage. Even if they could not enter the Fulu school in the end, they would still have some insights into the Fulu Tao. Over the millennia, countless people were inspired by this and created new Fulu Tao. They established their own sects outside and became the external branches of the Fulu school. The precious materials and the extremely low success rate caused the Fulu school to only produce a few in a year. It was no wonder that when Yuzhen Zi extorted that head, his expression was so pained. For a peak head, this level of Fulu was no different from cutting off his flesh. This time, Li Mu was not in a hurry to draw a talisman. Instead, he looked around and sized up this strange world. As far as his eyes could see, everything was white. At first, Li Mu thought that this was some kind of illusion. Later on, he gradually realized that this should be a flask heaven space. The table in front of him was real. The talisman brush, talisman paper, talisman materials were all real. The Fulu that was drawn was also real. The Fulu school had really invested a lot in this trial. The materials needed to make a heaven-level Fulu talisman liquid were all wasted. It was a great loss. The young man in front of Li Mu had clearly succeeded. If Li Mu wanted to be in the same position as him, he would have to draw this heaven-level Fulu. Li Mu slowly let out a sigh of relief. He chanted the heart-calming mantra again and began to study this Fulu composed of complex talisman characters. 2 hours later, on the 55th stone step, Li Mu slowly opened his eyes. Next to him, the young man did not move forward. Instead, he looked at Li Mu with deep shock in his turbid eyes. With his half-step transcendence cultivation, he still needed to use all his strength and a certain amount of luck to be able to draw a low-grade heaven-level Fulu. How could he not see that this person's true strength was only in his divine arts? Even if he didn't use his magic power or comprehension to draw a talisman, this Fulu was truly drawn by him. A strange light flashed in the young man's eyes. At this moment, The person in front of him gave him the feeling of a 3-year-old child holding a 2-foot-long spear and performing a set of spear techniques that even he felt inferior to. He glanced at Li Mu and walked up the next step. Li Mu observed his back and found that this person's body was between illusory and real. It seemed that his guess was right. What was left behind on the stone steps was only a shadow. His body had entered another space. The fourth trial seemed to be on this mountain peak, but it was actually in the flask heaven space created by the upper realm powerhouses of the Fulu school. Li Mu meditated on the spot. Not long after, the young man's figure on the stone steps in front of him suddenly solidified. In the next moment, his body was teleported out. Obviously, he'd failed in this grade of talisman. The young man appeared below with a gloomy face. He looked up at the remaining figure on the stone steps. There was no one in front of him. Li Mu sighed in relief and slowly stood up. If this person advanced another step, the pressure would be great. Chapter 333. Li Mu looked at the mysterious runes in the flask space and was speechless. In the main peak's Taoist palace, the first seats were also shocked by the head teacher's actions. Hyun Jinko said in disbelief, "Senior brother head teacher, isn't the gap too big? In today's cultivation world, including our Fulu school, I've never heard of anyone who could draw a saint-level Fulu." Jade Emperor Peak's first seat Jingyangzi said, "The saint-level rune liquid is too precious. If it's used to draw a saint-level Fulu, you can draw more than 10 middle-level or upper-level ones." Songling Peak's first seat Master Ashen Pine hesitated for a moment and also advised, "In the fourth stage of the trial, the Fulu of the same level should be the same. One middle-level heaven level and the other saint level, isn't it a little unfair?" Fulu School's head teacher looked at them with a deep gaze and said, "The middle-level heaven level might not be his limit. I want to take a gamble." They thought for a moment and understood the head teacher's meaning. The person that concealed his identity earlier had already stopped at this level. If Li Mu was able to draw a mid-grade heaven-rank talisman at this level, then he would be the first in the Tao of Talismans trial this time. People who could draw a middle-level heaven-level Fulu were rare in Fulu school. Other than the head teacher, the 7 first seats only had less than a 10% chance of success. However, although it was rare, it still existed. However, to draw a saint-level Fulu, one's cultivation had to be in the upper realm. In the entire Fulu school, only the head teacher and the 2 grand elders had this kind of power. Moreover, having the power to draw a talisman did not mean that the talisman would succeed. The success rate of drawing a saint-level Fulu talisman was less than 10%. The materials for a saint-level talisman were extremely precious and could not be wasted. The materials used to draw a saint-level Fulu could be used to draw more than 10 heaven-level Fulu. They would usually choose to use them to create a heaven-level talisman. Now, the head teacher was giving the materials that he was reluctant to use to a 4th realm cultivator. Although the first seats were astonished, they didn't say anything. Based on their understanding of the sect leader, if he wasn't certain, he wouldn't take such a risk. He was willing to gamble with Li Mu this time, perhaps because he had already calculated some clues. Everyone looked at the image of the mystic light technique with anticipation. Within the flask space, Li Mu had yet to recover from the shock. No wonder that person failed so quickly. Motherf asterisk Kerr, was this talisman drawn by a human? Li Mu even guessed that this Fulu was not a middle-grade heaven-class item, but a high-grade one. It was simply something the Fulu school used to make things difficult for people. Just looking at the runes gave him a headache, not to mention writing runes. Li Mu wanted to give up at the first moment, but he forced himself to hold back. He could not give up. The person from before had stopped at this stage. If he gave up, he would only be able to fight to a draw with him. It was still unknown who would emerge victorious in the end. However, for Li Qing's sake, he had to get this talisman. Li Mu took a deep breath and endured the dizziness as he looked at the Fulu. On the main peak of Mount Bayan. 3 days had passed. The crowd in the square gathered and dispersed, then gathered again. At this time, there were only a dozen people standing in the square, looking up at the image in the sky. He's been standing there for 3 days. When will it end? If you're not confident, just give up. There's no point in continuing like this. In the image, the figure standing on the stone steps, shrouded in clouds and mist, had been standing there for 3 whole days. This had never happened in the past trials. Everyone on Mount Bayun was waiting for him alone. Below the stone steps, nearly 100 people sat cross-legged and meditated, occasionally looking up. 3 days was nothing to cultivators. Those who had not walked the stone steps personally did not know how difficult it was to climb each step. They only had respect for those who could reach the 50th step. The young man standing at the bottom of the stone steps had been looking at Li Mu for 3 whole days. There was no anxiety on his face as he looked calmly at Li Mu's back. There was a hint of suspicion in his eyes as he muttered, "It's been 3 days. What the hell is Xian Jizi doing?" According to the rules of the Tao of Talismans trial, a cultivator could stay on every step for a maximum of 6 hours. If he hadn't started writing talismans after 6 hours had passed, then he would be directly teleported to the bottom and the trial would be terminated. However, the junior that he could not see through had been standing on the 56th step for 3 whole days. He could not figure it out. He acknowledged the junior's strength. There was no reason for him to be so careful with a mere heaven-grade golden armor divine army talisman. If he could not draw it, he could not draw it even if he stood there for 3 years, let alone 3 days. If he succeeded, he would have succeeded 3 days ago. If he failed, he would have failed 3 days ago. How could he drag it out until today? Tao Palace of the main peak. Several heads, including the Fulu School's headmaster, had not taken a single step out of the palace during these 3 days. In the scene shown by the profound light technique, Li Mu was holding a talisman brush and drawing a certain talisman in the air. He had already drawn it a few thousand times. His face was pale and his aura was weak. His eyes were bloodshot, but his gaze was increasingly confident. At a certain moment, Li Mu sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes. He threw a few pills into his mouth and began to quickly recover his spirit. After a quarter of an hour, he stood up again and walked to the table. There was a talisman paper on the table. This talisman paper was several times larger than an ordinary talisman paper. It was not yellow paper. The talisman paper itself emitted bursts of spiritual energy. It should be made from the wood pulp of some kind of precious tree. At the corner of the table, there was a jade bowl filled with golden talisman liquid. 4 Fulu below the earth stage, one could use cinnabar to draw talismans. For those above the earth stage, one needed a special talisman liquid. This golden talisman liquid emitted a faint fragrance. Li Mu swallowed his saliva and recited the clear heart technique. Only then did he resist the urge to drink it in one gulp. The higher the level of the Fulu, the stronger the spiritual energy contained in the spirit liquid. This bowl of spirit liquid was enough to make his body explode. After adjusting his state to its peak, Li Mu picked up the talisman brush and prepared to draw talismans. Because there was only one chance for the trial, he had already practiced the Fulu's talisman thousands of times in the past 3 days. He had already memorized it by heart and would not make a mistake. As for spiritual energy, he did not know how this talisman brush worked. It could actually draw on the spiritual energy of the Fulu School's experts. Li Mu guessed that the one who provided him with the spiritual energy should be one of the heads. He had never controlled such powerful spiritual energy. It even gave him the illusion that he could fight with the Empress. He had not contacted the Empress for 3 days. In this flask space, the spiritual snail could not send messages. Moreover, there was a live broadcast of the trial using the dark light technique. Li Mu could not chat with the Empress. He cast these thoughts aside. After calming down, he began to focus on drawing talismans. He held the talisman brush, controlled the majestic spiritual energy, and made the first stroke. In the Taoist palace, the heads of the peaks were also extremely focused. In the Tao of Fulu, one must acknowledge the existence of talent. Talent was more important than hard work. This was also the common understanding of everyone. Li Mu's talent in the Tao of Talismans was rare in the world. However, what he was drawing now was a saint-level Fulu. There were originally 6 levels of Fulu. People only knew about the heaven, earth, black and yellow, but not the divine. This was because the last two levels of Fulu were rarely seen. The Fulu school had saint-level Fulu, but that was left behind by the sect's seniors hundreds of years ago. In these hundreds of years, countless experts in the Fulu school had not been able to draw a single saint-level Fulu. Could this young man in the drawing possibly add a saint-level Fulu to the Fulu school? In the flask space, Li Mu was fully focused on drawing. Although this Fulu was complicated, after 3 days of practice, he was already very familiar with it. He had even developed muscle memory. With his eyes closed and without thinking, he could draw it out instinctively. Of course, he was not so careless. There was only one chance. If he made a mistake, he would have to fight an extra round with that unidentified young man. His opponent was most likely an old monster. This was Li Mu's only chance. Li Mu concentrated, seriously writing the runes and carefully controlling his spiritual energy. This was very taxing on his mind. Li Mu's face was pale, and his clothes were soaked in sweat. However, he still gritted his teeth and persevered. When he reached the last stroke of the last rune, Li Mu held his breath and focused, gently placing the brush down. The talisman paper was unharmed, the brush was unharmed, and his spiritual energy did not leak out. It was all sealed in the Fulu. Puff! Li Mu spat out a mouthful of blood and collapsed to the ground. This was caused by overdrawing his mind for a long time. The exhaustion of this Fulu on his mind was far beyond his imagination. His figure flashed, and he fell on the stone steps. He's out. He's finally out. He wasn't teleported, he succeeded. 3 days, 3 whole days. What kind of Fulu did he draw? On the main peak square, below the stone steps, countless people exclaimed. The 3 days of waiting had finally come to an end. However, before they could say anything, they seemed to sense something and looked up at the sky. The White Cloud Mountain was the ancestral court of the Talisman sect. The weather was as clear as day for hundreds of years, and every day was a beautiful day. However, today, thick dark clouds suddenly gathered in the sky. The dark clouds gathered at an extremely fast speed. In a few breaths, they occupied the entire sky above everyone's heads. In the dark clouds, lightning snakes danced wildly like giant dragons. Under the dark clouds, whether it was the disciples of White Cloud Mountain or the trial takers, they all felt as if a huge rock was pressing down on their hearts, making it difficult for them to breathe. Everyone's faces were filled with horror. This was a scene they had never seen before in their lives. Below the stone steps, the young man's expression changed greatly after a short moment of shock. He said in shock, "Heavenly tribulation, this is the heavenly tribulation of a saint-level Fulu. A saint-level Fulu has descended." As if realizing something, he suddenly turned his head and looked at Li Mu, who was above the stone steps. Could it be that he had been drawing a saint-level Fulu for the past 3 days? Chapter 334. The Tao Bell covered the sky and completely enveloped White Cloud Mountain. On White Cloud Mountain, the disciples and trial takers looked up and saw a huge illusory and transparent bell shadow. Although there was a long crack on the bell shadow, it still gave the disciples of White Cloud Mountain an incomparable sense of security. Outside the law bell were dark clouds that were so low that one would feel suffocated just by looking at them. Lightning danced wildly in the dark clouds. Some were as thin as pythons, while others were as thick as dragons. They constantly swam in the dark clouds and eventually poured down on White Cloud Mountain. Countless bolts of lightning enveloped White Cloud Mountain as if it was the end of the world. When the lightning landed on the Tao Bell, it was completely absorbed. The Tao Bell's shadow became even more illusory, but it still firmly enveloped White Cloud Mountain. The few figures that rushed into the sky were the Flu School's headmaster and the 5 first seats. After releasing the first wave of lightning, more lightning began to brew in the dark clouds. The Flu School's headmaster and the 5 first seats flew into the dark clouds. They heard continuous rumbling sounds coming from the dark clouds, revealing a rainbow-colored Dharma spell light. The lightning in the dark clouds became fewer and fewer, Li Mu sat on the stone steps below and looked up at the strange phenomenon in the sky. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was amiss. The Talisman Sutra mentioned that the Lu of the world was divided into 6 grades: yellow, mystic, earth, and heaven. Above them were saint level and divine level. Most cultivators only knew about heaven, earth, mystic, and yellow because the first 4 grades were the most common. This was the best explanation based on the ability of writing talismans and the ability to conserve materials. The difficulty of inscribing talismans increased exponentially with each rank. 4 yellow rank talismans, once low-level cultivators familiarized themselves with them, they would be able to complete 100% of the talismans. As long as they had enough yellow paper and cinnabar, they would be able to inscribe yellow rank talismans. However, even a transcendent expert couldn't guarantee a success rate for heaven-level Lu. The success rate for saint-level Lu was so low that the materials for writing talismans were basically given for free. After diluting materials of that grade, one could successfully draw more than 10 heaven-level Lu. No sect could afford to waste them. Li Mu had only seen a few heaven-ranked Fulu talismans. Talisman books would not have this kind of high-level Fulu. This was the core secret of the Fulu school, but he had a golden armor talisman in his hand. Previously, Li Mu had wholeheartedly wanted to win the trial, so he didn't have any distracting thoughts. At this moment, they were all looking at Li Mu with fervent gazes. If it were in the past, Li Mu might have been a little polite to them. After knowing that he had been made a fool of, Li Mu naturally did not have a good expression. He stretched out his hand and said, "Give me the token." He had endured until now for the sake of that talisman. When he got the token, he would settle another score with them. The head teacher of the Fulu school smiled and said, "Even without the token, you can join the ancestral court at any time and become a core disciple." The token was not for him to use. Li Mu had no desire to join the Fulu school. He did not withdraw his hand and repeated, "Give me the token." The Fulu school's head teacher calculated with his fingers and revealed a look of understanding. He said, "So it's not for yourself. Since he's your friend, you can let him come to Mount Baiyun. There's no need for trials. He can directly enter the sect and enjoy the treatment of a core disciple." Li Mu looked at the Fulu school's head teacher. The dermic powers in his body began to run amok. Why did he work so hard? Was it not for that token? Now, he was told not to use the token. Where was the Fulu school's bottom line? Where were their principles? Li Mu spat out another mouthful of blood. He felt the world spinning. His vision turned black and he lost consciousness. Hyun Jinko hurriedly supported him. After using his dermic powers to check, he said, "His mind is severely overdrawn. He needs to rest well." The Fulu school's head teacher held Li Mu's wrist and passed over a strand of dermic powers. He said, "Let him rest well first. We'll talk about other things after he wakes up." Although the Fulu school's Talisman Dao trial was a few days later than the previous years, it had finally ended. More than 6,000 people participated in the trial. In the end, only 52 people obtained the opportunity to become a disciple of the Fulu school. Those who passed the 4 trials would stay on Mount Baiyun. The rest would return to where they came from. The younger ones among them would have the opportunity to participate in the next trial. Those who were 26 years old and above would have no chance of becoming a disciple of the Fulu school in their lifetime. When the trial ended, the strange phenomenon that occurred on Mount Baiyun became a mystery in everyone's hearts. At the entrance of the Taoist palace on the main peak, Elder Su paced back and forth with a hesitant expression. He had been pacing back and forth for a long time. "Come in." Not long after, the head teacher's voice came from within the Taoist palace. Elder Su could only stride in. He opened his mouth several times, but he stopped himself. He was conflicted about an extremely important matter. If Li Mu did not pass the trial, then he would just treat what he said last time as a joke. What about becoming a core disciple first, then an elder, then a head teacher, and finally the head teacher? Elder Su used to think that what he said was a joke. But now he had successfully taken the first step. If he obtained first place in the trial, he would become a core disciple of the Fulu school. And the commotion above his head just now was most likely caused by him. Things seemed to be getting a little serious. He thought for a long time before raising his head to look at the Fulu school's head teacher. He said, "Head teacher, this disciple has an important matter to report." The Fulu school's head teacher listened to him and only smiled. He said, "I understand." Elder Su was somewhat stunned. He could not understand the head teacher's reaction. Ever since the establishment of the Fulu school, it had not participated in the worldly affairs of the imperial court. Although it cooperated with the imperial court, it also kept its distance. The imperial court coveted the Fulu school. This matter was not a small matter for the Fulu school. However, since the head teacher did not say anything, he could not say more. At this moment, the Fulu school's head teacher spoke again. "Send the second place of this trial here." This trial of talismans was the strangest one that Elder Su had ever seen in his life. Not to mention that rare phenomenon, no one had ever reached the 50th step in the past trials. This time, 2 people had appeared. Could it be that the heavens were foretelling that the Fulu school was about to prosper? Elder Su quickly sent the person to the Taoist palace on the main peak. The Fulu school's head teacher said, "Elder Su, you may leave." Elder Su looked at the young man with a puzzled expression, but he still left without a word. The young man stood in the Taoist palace and looked straight at the Fulu school's head teacher. The Fulu school's head teacher cupped his hands and said, "It's been 20 years since we last met, Uncle Master Fu Daozi. How have you been?" The young man's figure changed, and he turned from a young man in his 20s to an old man. The old man's hair and beard were all white, and his face was full of wrinkles. His body exuded a strong aura of lethargy. He looked at the Fulu school's head teacher and said indifferently, "Xian Jizi, you haven't improved in 20 years, White Cloud Peak." Li Mu woke up in bed and saw Xiao Bai and Wan Wan sitting on his left and right side of the bed, worried. "Young master, benefactor is awake." Seeing that Li Mu had woken up, smiles immediately appeared on their faces. Before Li Mu could say anything to them, he felt the spirit snail vibrate. The Empress was contacting him. Li Mu said to the 2 girls, "I'm a little hungry. Is there anything to eat at home?" Xiao Bai immediately said, "Benefactor, what do you want to eat?" "I'll make it for you," Li Mu said. "Just make some porridge." Xiao Bai and Wan Wan ran out to cook. In this world, most people were ordinary people, but there was no lack of talented people. For example, pure yin, pure yang, 5 elements body, and other special constitutions. If they chose the right cultivation direction, 1 day of cultivation would be equivalent to several days of cultivation for others. There were also natural spiritual eyes that could control fire and water. Although their cultivation speed might not be very fast, they were born with magical powers. After stepping into the path of cultivation, their strength would far surpass their peers. The heart of 7 orifices was one of the special constitutions. This kind of constitution could not increase the speed of cultivation, nor did it have magical powers. However, if they stepped into the path of cultivation, they would have an advantage that no other special constitutions had. They would not have inner demons. Not only would they not have inner demons, but any illusion, soul control, or soul-searching techniques would be useless against them. This was because their heart of 7 orifices was exquisite. They could maintain their inner calmness at any time and would not be disturbed by external matters. This was a trait that even upper realm cultivators envied. Cultivating the Tao was easy, but cultivating the heart was difficult. Inner demons did not care about the cultivation level of the cultivator, whether it was soul refining or transcending. Even transcending cultivators could not completely rid themselves of the inner demons. For cultivators with profound cultivation, the reason why they failed in writing talismans was not because they could not remember the runes, nor was it because they did not have enough magical power. It was because they could not calm their heart. They could calm their heart for a moment, but writing heaven rank or saint rank Fulu would take too long. It was difficult to maintain a calm heart for a long time. However, for those with the heart of 7 orifices, this worry did not exist. Others used their mind to control their heart, but he used his heart to control his mind and body. The heart of 7 orifices was the special constitution that all talisman writers desired the most. It was a pity that the quarter-hour physique was too rare. They had only heard of it in rumors. After thinking about it, they could basically confirm that Li Mu was an extremely rare person who possessed the heart of 7 orifices. Otherwise, it would be hard to explain why he could draw a saint-rank Fulu with only a 4th realm cultivation and the help of the sect master. This ability was a gift from the heavens, and it was something that anyone could only be envious of. He has the pure yang physique and the heart of 7 orifices at the same time. Could he be the son of destiny? He is really blessed by the heavens. Not only does he have the pure yang physique, but the heart of 7 orifices is even rarer, they sighed. Master Ashenpine suddenly asked, "Why did Martial Uncle Fu Daozi suddenly return after leaving the sect for 20 years? Hyun Jinko shook his head and said, "Martial Uncle passed the position of sect master to senior brother and not him." Martial Uncle Fu Daozi left the sect in anger. This time, he returned to the sect and used his incarnation to disturb the Talisman Dao trial. If it was not for Li Mu, this matter would not have ended. I'm afraid he came with ill intentions. Master Ashenpine seemed to have thought of something and suddenly said, "Where is Martial Uncle Fu Daozi?" They looked at each other and exclaimed in unison, "Oh no!" White Cloud Peak, the small residence. As an injured person, Li Mu was enjoying the feeding service of Xiaobai and Wanwan when he suddenly felt a wave of exhaustion. When he realized that something was wrong and recited the heart-calming technique, Wanwan and Xiaobai had already collapsed. At the same time, an old man had appeared in his room. The old man's hair and beard were completely white while his face was densely covered in wrinkles. He looked extremely aged and seemed as if he would step into the coffin at any moment. When he saw Li Mu was still conscious, the old man revealed a delighted expression and said, "It really is the heart of 7 orifices." This old man gave Li Mu a very familiar feeling. After checking Xiaobai and Wanwan and discovering that they were only unconscious, Li Mu asked sternly, "Who are you?" The old man looked at Li Mu with burning eyes and said, "I am Fu Daozi, the supreme elder of Fulu School. The current head of Fulu School, Shen Jizi, has to call me Martial Uncle when you see me. Little fellow, are you willing to take me as your master?" Li Mu looked into the old man's eyes and finally knew why he felt this old man was so familiar. Wasn't he the young man who had almost defeated him in the Talisman Dao trial? Li Mu was stunned. He looked at him and asked, "You are the supreme elder of Fulu School and a transcendent expert?" Fu Daozi coughed and said awkwardly, "I am Dongxian, but I am only 1 step away from transcendent." Only 1 step away from transcendent. The meaning of this sentence was very subtle. The Taoist priest that Li Mu knew was also 1 step away from transcendent. Vice Principal Huang of 100 Rivers Academy was said to have 1 foot in transcendent. But his other foot might not be able to step into transcendent even if he died. If he wasn't transcendent, then he should forget about taking him as his master. Li Mu's cultivation was guided by the Empress. Even if he was transcendent, Li Mu wouldn't agree, let alone if he wasn't transcendent. He wouldn't even consider it. Li Mu shook his head and said, "I don't want to." Fu Daozi was stunned and asked, "Why?" Li Mu asked in return, "What can you teach me?" Fu Daozi said, "I have traveled for many years and know countless divine arts." Li Mu shook his head and said, "Someone taught me divine arts and divine arts." Fu Daozi frowned and said, "Who is it? Is he stronger than me, or is he more knowledgeable than me?" Li Mu said, "The Empress of Great Zhou." Fu Daozi couldn't catch his breath and coughed a few times. He couldn't compare to the Empress of Great Zhou. She had the Emperor's qi and her cultivation was transcendent. She relied on the Great Zhou court. Among the 4 sects and 6 schools, who could be more knowledgeable than the royal family? Fu Daozi thought for a moment and said, "No one in Fulu School can compare to me in Talisman Dao cultivation." Li Mu asked, can you draw a saint-level Fulu? Fu Daozi, I can. Li Mu looked at him and continued, I don't need anyone to teach me the Tao of Fulu. Fu Daozi thought for a moment and suddenly walked forward. He grabbed Li Mu's shoulder and rushed out of the room. He flew out of Baiyun Peak and was about to fly out of the mountain. At the critical moment, Li Mu whistled. Under the support of his dermic powers, the whistle spread far and wide. Buzz. Suddenly, a buzzing sound came from the main peak. A golden light flew over and slammed into Fu Daozi. Fu Daozi's expression changed, and he hurriedly threw Li Mu aside. A golden rune appeared in each of his palms and faced the golden light. The Tao Bell ignored Fu Daozi and directly enlarged. It changed direction in the air and covered Li Mu. At the same time, several auras soared into the sky from the main peak. Several figures surrounded Fu Daozi. Fu Daozi's face was gloomy as he asked, Xianjizi, are you going to go against me again today? Xianjizi looked at Fu Daozi and shook his head. His identity is special. I can't let Uncle Master take him away today. Fu Daozi said coldly, what special identity? Didn't all of you take a fancy to his heart of 7 orifices and want to keep him in Fulu school? Xianjizi said, didn't Uncle Master take a fancy to that too? Fu Daozi didn't say anything. He just looked at Xianjizi and the other peak masters with a complicated gaze. After a while, he looked at everyone and shook his head. It's been 20 years since we last met. All of you have become sect masters and peak masters, he said in a self-deprecating manner, and his body exuded a strong sense of lethargy. Hyun Jinko and the others had complicated gazes. The senior of the sect that they once respected greatly and was like the sun in the midday sky was now unavoidable. Fu Daozi looked at Xianjizi again and said, I only have less than half a year left in my lifespan. Let me take this kid away. I can't leave my legacy without a successor. Xianjizi didn't say anything. A Fulu floated out of his sleeve and flew towards Fu Daozi. Looking at the talisman, Li Mu's face revealed a bitter expression. For the sake of this talisman he had nearly worked himself to death in the past 3 days. Fu Daozi looked at the Fulu and his expression changed drastically. He exclaimed, Heavenly Secret Talisman. This talisman was called the Heavenly Secret Talisman, and its function was to conceal the secrets of the heavens. This saint-grade Heavenly Secret Talisman could help him conceal the secrets of the heavens. It could at least increase his lifespan by 10 years. Xianjizi looked at Fu Daozi and said with a smile, This young friend is a subordinate of Her Majesty the Empress of the Great Zhou. If Martial Uncle wants to accept a disciple, you have to ask for his opinion. If he agrees, we won't stop you. If he doesn't agree, Martial Uncle will bring disaster to you by taking him away. After that, he looked at Li Mu and asked, Young friend, are you willing to be Martial Uncle Fu Daozi's disciple? Li Mu waved his hand and said, We'll talk about this later. First, return the talisman that you owe me. Xianjizi flipped his hand and a jade talisman appeared in his palm. It slowly flew towards Li Mu. Li Mu took the jade talisman. It was unusually warm in his hand. There was a flowing golden rune in the jade talisman. Although he didn't recognize the Fulu school's talisman, he thought that the head of a sect wouldn't lie to him. After accepting the talisman, Li Mu's face darkened. He said, I'm afraid your sect has to give me and Her Majesty an explanation for using me, right? Li Mu originally wanted that saint-grade talisman amulet, but it was of great use to Talisman Daozi. In any case, Talisman Daozi was still young and had nothing but a long life, so Li Mu took it as pity on the old man. However, Li Mu didn't intend to let Xianjizi and the others off so easily. Xianjizi knew what Li Mu was talking about. He asked, What explanation do you want, Lord Li? Since Li Mu called himself, this official, Xianjizi called him Lord Li. At this moment, the conversation between the two was between the Fulu school and the Great Zhou court. Li Mu was waiting for him to say this. He said, 5 saint-level Fulu. Xianjizi nodded and said, Okay. Li Mu was stunned for a moment. When he came back to his senses, he regretted it. He felt that he had suffered a loss. He asked for 5 saint-level Fulu, but Xianjizi actually agreed without hesitation. If he had known, he would have asked for 10. He still hadn't seen the world. His vision was too small. However, since he had said it, Li Mu couldn't go back on his words. Otherwise, not only would he lose face, but also the Empress's. He could be shameless, but the Empress's dignity had to be protected at all times. Fu Daozi held the saint-level Fulu with a complicated look in his eyes. Xian Jizi looked at him and said, "Welcome back, martial uncle." Hyun Jinko and the others also cupped their fists and bowed. They said, "Welcome back, martial uncle." Li Mu didn't want to get involved in the affairs of the Fulu school. He took the Dao Bell and flew to Baiyun Peak. He saw Wan Wan and Xiao Bai looking anxious. Beside them was a figure that Li Mu had missed for a long time. "Young master, benefactor." Li Mu flew to the courtyard and patted the heads of the two little girls. He said, "Don't worry, I'm fine." Then he pulled Lu Hanyan into his arms and said, "If you didn't come out of seclusion, I would have to return to the divine capital." Lu Hanyan said with a red face, "I counted the days and thought that you should be here. Master said that I was restless these 2 days and that seclusion was useless, so he let me out." After she said that, she thought of something and held Li Mu's hand. She asked, "I heard from Wan Wan and Xiao Bai that you participated in the Talisman Dao trial. Didn't you say that you didn't want to become a disciple of the Fulu school?" Li Mu was stunned for a moment. Then he hugged her tightly again and said, "Because I want to be in the same sect as you." At this time, Xianjizi said, "According to the past practice, the disciples recruited by the Talisman Dao trial can only become the 4th-generation disciples. If you enter the Fulu school, I can make an exception and let you become a disciple of a peak master." As soon as he finished speaking, a figure walked into the Dao Palace. Li Mu looked back and found that the person was Fu Daozi, who was called Uncle Master by Xianjizi and the others. Talisman Daozi walked up to Li Mu and passed a jade slip to him. He said, "Even though you're unwilling to take me as your master, you've given me 10 more years of lifespan. I'll give you my lifetime's comprehension of the Talisman Dao. I hope you'll be able to bring my Talisman Dao to greater heights." Xianjizi looked at the old man and said, "There are many talented disciples in the ancestral court. If Uncle Master is willing, you can choose one of them to inherit your mantle." Taoist Talisman revealed a proud expression as he said, "They aren't worthy of inheriting my mantle." Xianjizi shook his head but didn't say anything. Although this Uncle Master's attainments in the Talisman Dao were extraordinary, he had a strange temper. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left the Fulu school 20 years ago. He could only give him advice on this matter and couldn't make the decision for him. Li Mu stood in the Dao Palace and thought quickly. He definitely had to join the Fulu school. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to explain it to the Empress and Lu Hanyan. Xianjizi just said that he could choose a peak master. In this way, he would become a 3rd-generation disciple like Lu Hanyan. The sect master and the peak masters were all 2nd-generation disciples. Li Mu had been unhappy with them for a long time and didn't want to be inferior to them after joining the sect. If he became Fu Daozi's disciple, he would be a 2nd-generation disciple and be in the same generation as the sect master and the peak masters. He would also be able to take charge of the Fulu school in the second half of the plan. Now that he had the status, the only thing he lacked was his cultivation. When his cultivation improved, he could draw Fulu at will and bring glory to the Fulu school. At that time, how could Xianjizi still have the face to occupy the position of the sect master? Thinking of this, Li Mu suddenly looked at Fu Daozi and said, "I'm willing to be your disciple." Xianjizi was stunned. Fu Daozi was stunned for a moment before he looked at Li Mu in surprise and asked, "What did you say?" Li Mu cupped his fists and bowed to him. He repeated, "I'm willing to be your disciple." Fu Daozi grabbed his hand and said excitedly, "Good, good, good. I didn't expect that I would be able to take in a disciple with the heart of 7 orifices before I die." "Don't worry, before I die, I will teach you all my Talisman Dao comprehension." Li Mu didn't know what the heart of 7 orifices was, But since Fu Daozi had the first impression and explained it for him, he didn't even have to make up a reason. Originally, he was slightly resistant to taking a stranger as his master. But at this moment, when he saw an old man with one foot in the grave, who was so excited that his eyes were filled with tears and his white beard was trembling, for some reason, that trace of resistance quickly disappeared. Li Mu said with a smile, "When my mind recovers, I will draw a few more heavenly secret talismans for you." Fu Daozi said with a gratified expression, "The heavenly secret talisman can only conceal the heavenly secret once. After 10 years, if I can't advance to the transcendence realm, it will be the day of my death. However, I have no regrets to take in such a disciple. So what if those old fellows have a higher cultivation than me? Can their disciples be as powerful as my disciples?" A moment later, in a Dao palace behind the main peak, Li Mu knelt on the ground and bowed respectfully to Fu Daozi 3 times. He said, "Greetings, Master." The Grand Elder's disciple recruitment was supposed to be a grand ceremony. 3 months in advance, all the disciples of the Talisman Puppet Sect's ancestral court and the sect masters of the subsects were supposed to come from all over to congratulate him. As soon as Xian Jizi proposed it, Li Mu and Fu Daozi rejected it at the same time. Li Mu didn't want to be high profile, but Fu Daozi obviously had other reasons. Fu Daozi personally helped Li Mu up and said, 20 years ago, I was dissatisfied with senior brother passing the position of sect master to Xian Jizi, so I left Mount Baiyun in anger. This time, I returned to the mountain only to find a disciple to pass on my talisman Dao before the end of my life. As for other miscellaneous matters, it's better to avoid them. Li Mu could feel the lethargy in his body and the unwillingness in his tone. He could only say, there are still 10 years. Perhaps in these 10 years, Master can find a way to transcend. Fu Daozi shook his head and said, if I could find it, I would have found it long ago. You don't have to feel sorry for me. I have experienced everything in my life. If I can find a disciple who can pass on my talisman Dao before the end of my life, I will die without regrets. At that time, you can find a mountain on Mount Baiyun and bury me. Every year, you can come to burn an incense stick, so that we won't be in vain." He was disappointed for a while, but then he became excited again. He looked at Li Mu with shining eyes and said, there are still 10 years. You can do a lot of things in 10 years. You have the heart of 7 orifices, so you can definitely pass on my talisman Dao. Unfortunately, it's difficult for you to break through to the transcendence realm in 10 years. Li Mu continued to shake his head. Lu Hanyan thought for a moment and muttered, could it be that your master is the sect master? Even if that's the case, you still have to call me senior sister. Li Mu knocked her head lightly and looked at her with a smile. Martial niece Lu, don't be rude to your martial uncle. Chapter 337. Martial niece, I'll give in to you. Yu Han-yun pinched Li Mu's waist and said through gritted teeth, you're not allowed to get on my bed tonight. Being a second-generation disciple of the Fugu school, the same generation as the head of the sect, was something to be proud of. But Li Mu obviously showed off to the wrong person. It was late at night. He lay alone on the bed in the wing room, staring at the roof in a daze. There were always many unpredictable things in life. Before coming to Mount Baiyun, Li Mu didn't expect that he would participate in the trial of Talisman Taoism, become the disciple of the Grand Elder, and shoulder the heavy responsibility of becoming the next head of the sect. Whether it was for the Empress or for Talisman Daozi's last wish, he inexplicably had another great goal. Late at night, Li Mu took out the jade slip given to him by Talisman Daozi and put it on his forehead. In this jade slip, there were more than 100 years of Talisman Daozi's comprehension of Talisman Taoism. Compared with these powerhouses who had been immersed in Talisman Taoism for decades or even hundreds of years, Li Mu didn't even know a little about Talisman Taoism. He only knew how to draw talismans, but he didn't know anything about talismans. This jade slip undoubtedly opened the door to a new world for Li Mu. It let Li Mu know that Talisman Taoism could be used in this way, Talisman Daozi was a once-in-a-century genius of talisman Taoism, but his talent in cultivation was not particularly outstanding. So far, he had not taken the key step. Even though with his attainments in talisman Taoism, he could fight against a transcendent realm master with his cultivation in Dongxian, but he was still not a transcendent realm master. Under the transcendent realm, the lifespan of cultivators was not much longer than that of humans. Because of cultivation and health preservation, cultivators in Dongxian could live for more than 60 years, which was equivalent to the oldest among mortals. If there were no accidents, cultivators in the divine power realm and the creation realm could live for more than 100 years. The reason why cultivators seemed to live longer was that they were free from disease and disaster, and they knew how to cultivate and maintain their health. Therefore, they could easily live for decades or even hundreds of years. Mortals lived for decades. If they paid attention to their health, their lifespan might not be shorter than cultivators. Talisman Daozi had already lived for 2 cycles of 60 years, and his life was about to end. Even though the heavenly secret talisman could buy him 10 years of time, he would still perish if he couldn't advance within these 10 years. The jade slip contained all his comprehensions of the Tao of talismans. Li Mu could sense the expectations that Talisman Daozi had for him. He truly regarded Li Mu as his personal disciple. When Yu Han-yun entered the sect, Hyun Jinko gave her a chance to comprehend the Tao page. Although what she comprehended was a copy, she gained a lot. As a second-generation disciple, Li Mu could directly comprehend the original page of the Tao page. In the Tao Palace, Xian Jizi stretched out his hand. A yellowed piece of paper appeared in his palm. There were no words on the paper. It looked simple and unadorned as it floated quietly in Hyun Jinko's palm. Fu Daozi stood beside Li Mu and said seriously, "The Tao page is a page of the Tao scripture. It contains the supreme Tao." The founder of the Fugu school obtained this page. After comprehending it, he left the Fugu school's orthodoxy behind. This is a rare opportunity. Study it well. It will be of great benefit to your future cultivation. Xian Jizi looked at Li Mu and said, "This page of the Tao scripture contains the talisman's Tao. Different people will comprehend different things. How much you can comprehend will depend on your luck." Li Mu had a good understanding of the Tao scripture. It was said that most of the supernatural powers, Tao techniques, talisman, pills, and array formations in the current cultivation world originated from the Tao scripture. Anyone who obtained any page of the Tao scripture could establish a sect. That was how the 6 sects of the Tao sect came about. The Tao page slowly floated over from Xian Jizi's palm. Li Mu reached out and pressed his hand on it. In the next moment, he entered a white world. Unlike the world he entered when he participated in the trial, this world was a vast expanse of white. Even when Li Mu put his hand in front of his eyes, he could only see white. He was wrapped in a white fog that he could not see clearly. In the fog, there was a flash of golden light from time to time. It was so fast that one could not see it clearly. Li Mu tried to chase after the golden light, but the golden light flashed and disappeared. The more he wanted to see it clearly, the faster the golden light flashed in the white fog. In the end, he could only see a blurry afterimage. This feeling was similar to when Li Mu first drew talismans. The more he wanted to draw it in one go, the more restless his heart was and the greater the possibility of failure. Therefore, Li Mu sat down cross-legged and began to recite the Clear Heart Sutra. In the Tao Palace of the main peak, Xian Jizi looked at Li Mu, who was sitting cross-legged, and said indifferently, "It seems that he has found the trick. I wonder how many talisman he can comprehend in the end." Talisman Daozi asked, "How many did you comprehend back then?" Xian Jizi said, "I'm ashamed. I only comprehended 10. I can't compare to Martial Uncle." Talisman Daozi glanced at him and said, "But your luck isn't bad. The talismans you've comprehended are new talismans that no one else has comprehended. Amongst the 15 talismans I've comprehended, 8 of them were comprehended by others." Chapter 338. Qian or 800? Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu in a daze. Even Xian Jizi's expression was full of shock. The Tao page was extremely mysterious. Since ancient times, those who could comprehend several Tao pages from it were already geniuses. Those who could comprehend more than 10 Tao pages were geniuses among geniuses. Those disciples later became famous masters of the Fugu school. They couldn't find a single word to describe it. Li Mu couldn't figure out their expressions and asked, "What's wrong? Is there a problem?" After Fu Daozi came to his senses, he asked again, "How many talisman do you remember?" Li Mu said embarrassedly, "1." In fact, he had only carefully memorized the first talisman. Later, Li Mu was stunned by the scene after the white fog dissipated. The huge monster and the strange human were beyond his knowledge and experience. How could he be in the mood to memorize the talisman? That's impossible. Fu Daozi's face was full of disbelief. Then he asked Li Mu, "What did you see in the Tao page?" Li Mu said, "A continent where powerful monsters wreaked havoc. Some human beings could condense talismans in the void and draw powerful talismans. They used the talisman to attack and seal those monsters." Fu Daozi was stunned. He looked at Xian Jizi and asked, "What did you see at the beginning?" Xian Jizi said slowly, "White fog." Occasionally, a golden talisman flashed through the white fog. Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu again and said in confusion, "It's strange. All the people who comprehended the Tao page saw fog." "Why did you see this?" Li Mu explained. "In the beginning, there was only white fog. However, as one's heart calmed down, the white fog would become thinner. When one's heart calmed down completely, the white fog would completely dissipate. The golden talismans that you saw flashing through the white fog were created by those humans. They used their fingers to draw talismans in the air. Their purpose was to attack some of the monsters in the fog." I knew it. After Fu Daozi finished listening to Li Mu's description, an excited expression appeared on his face, and he said, "During the ancient times, the spirit energy of the heavens and the earth was extremely dense, so writing talismans didn't require the assistance of spirit liquids. Later on, the spirit energy of the heavens and the earth thinned greatly, so the seniors of the Tao sect relied on various spirit objects of the heavens and the earth to liquefy their spirit energy and use it as materials for writing talismans. This old man's guess is true, it's true." Li Mu said regretfully, "It's a pity that I didn't pay much attention to the talisman just now. If I can comprehend the Tao page again, I should be able to remember it." Xian Jizi shook his head. "You can only comprehend the Tao page once. Everyone only has one chance. Even if you touch it again, you won't be able to enter the world just now. However, what you see on the Tao page will be deeply engraved in your memory. As long as you meditate, you'll be able to recall it again." Hearing Xian Jizi's words, Li Mu closed his eyes and thought back to the scene he had just seen. Sure enough, the things he had seen on the Tao page appeared once again, and very clearly. Fu Daozi asked expectantly, "Do you remember now?" Li Mu nodded, "Yes." Fu Daozi continued to ask, "What kind of talisman are there?" Li Mu closed his eyes and stretched out his finger. According to the scene in his mind, he drew a few talismans in the void and said, "This talisman can turn an area into a sea of fire. The fire is blue and doesn't seem to be ordinary fire. As long as you touch it, you won't be able to get rid of it." Then he changed to another talisman and continued to speak. "This talisman can summon a lightning dragon. This talisman can freeze an area of 10,000 feet. This talisman can turn the earth into magma. This talisman can summon huge meteorites." After copying dozens of talisman, Li Mu opened his eyes and said, "There are too many talisman. I'm afraid there are more than 1,000 talismans. I can't finish them all in a short time." Fu Daozi looked at Li Mu in shock. After a while, he finally came to his senses and looked at Tian Jizi, saying, "You should abdicate." He put one hand on Tian Jizi's shoulder and said, "The Fugu school is destined to prosper in the hands of my disciple. If you don't give up the position of the headmaster, you will be hindering the prosperity of our sect. You have to apologize to the ancestors." Li Mu hurriedly said, "Master, forget it. There's no hurry. Fu Daozi didn't insist to the end. Instead, he said happily, "After seeing those talisman, I have comprehended something. I need to cultivate in seclusion for a few days to comprehend it." Fu Daozi left in a hurry. Li Mu stood in the Taoist palace and asked Xian Jizi, "What are those monsters?" Xian Jizi shook his head and said, "In ancient times, the spiritual qi of heaven and earth was rich and everything flourished. However, there weren't many things that were really passed down from that era. Everything that happened in that era has always been a mystery in the cultivation world." Li Mu asked doubtfully, "The Tao scripture didn't seem to be born that long ago, did it?" Xian Jizi explained, "People think that the Tao scripture was compiled by countless Taoist seniors more than 1,000 years ago. But in fact, the Tao scripture has existed for even longer. Perhaps it can be traced back to the ancient times. At that time, the Taoist seniors only passed down the orthodoxy of the various Taoist sects by comprehending the Tao pages. The ancient times were a long time ago for the people of this world. There were few records about the ancient times in this era. For some reason, the inheritance between the two eras was broken." The founder of the Fulu school only comprehended a portion of the pages, and yet he was able to establish the Fulu school. What would happen if he comprehended all of it? At that time, the title of the number one Taoist sect would change hands. Xian Jizi looked at Li Mu, who was lying on the chair, and asked, "Junior brother, have you comprehended all of the pages?" Li Mu extended his hand, and a jade slip appeared in his palm. He threw the jade slip to Xian Jizi and said, "The Fulu that appeared in the pages are all in here." Nothing ventured, nothing gained. The future leader had to have the bearing of a future leader. Li Mu was not worried that he would starve to death if he taught others the way of talismans. The stronger the talisman sect was, the more beneficial it would be for him and the empress. Xian Jizi placed the jade slip on his forehead, and a moment later, he passed it to Hyun Jinko, who was beside him. After Hyun Jinko read it, he passed it to Xingyang Zi. Apart from Yuzhen Zi, who was in seclusion, the other six heads all looked at the jade slip with longing and excitement in their eyes. They all knew what this jade slip meant. The founder of the Fulu school founded, and Li Mu would lead the Fulu school to an unprecedented peak. Not to mention that he had completely comprehended the pages and contributed the complete contents of the pages, just by relying on his heart of 7 orifices. If he was tied to the Fulu school and drew talismans day and night, in the future, the Fulu school's disciples would each have a saint-level attacking Fulu. Their attacks would be at the 7th realm, and they would be able to beat the 10 demonic sects together. Unfortunately, they couldn't tie him up. Not to mention that the materials needed for a saint-level Fulu were hard to find, and it was impossible to create an unlimited number of them. Martial Uncle Fu Daozi would also not allow them to do so. Not to mention, he had the Empress of the Great Zhou behind him. He was a treasure in the Fulu school, and in the heart of the Empress, he would also be a treasure. If the Fulu school forcibly detained him, it was very likely that the Great Zhou court would send a large force to suppress them. The strength of the Fulu school was unquestionable, but in the Great Zhou, the strength of any sect could not compare to the Great Zhou court. Xian Jizi put away the jade slip and bowed to Li Mu with cupped fists, saying, "Thank you, junior brother." As the head of the Fulu school, his bow represented the highest etiquette of the Fulu school. He bowed to Li Mu for his contributions to the Fulu school and for bringing the Fulu school to a new height. Li Mu waved his hand and said, "We're on the same side, there's no need to thank me." Xian Jizi smiled and said, "In that case, senior brother won't be polite." In fact, there's another important matter that concerns the future of the sect, and I need junior brother's help. Seeing Xian Jizi's expression, Li Mu began to regret what he had just said. As the head of the sect, Xian Jizi's face was as thick as his cultivation. Li Mu had become a second-generation disciple of the Fulu school, but he had not obtained any benefits, and had become a tool for them. Now, he actually had something to ask of him. How could he not feel embarrassed? Li Mu did not speak, but Xian Jizi took the initiative to say, although the ancestral court holds a trial of the Tao of Talismans every 4 years, the disciples who pass the trial have the aptitude for the Tao of Talismans, but most of them lack the talent for cultivation. Junior brother is a pillar of the great Zhou, a favored minister of the Empress. Can you borrow the power of the imperial court to help the sect recruit some cultivation geniuses with special constitutions from the common people, and nurture them from a young age? This head of the sect was really squeezing Li Mu's value in all aspects. Li Mu's face revealed a difficult expression. He said, "Senior brother also knows that the imperial court has its own rules. In principle, the local government is forbidden from revealing the people's birth characters." At this point, his tone changed and he said, "Of course, although I'm an official of the Great Zhou, I'm also a disciple of the Fulu school. I'll definitely think of the sect. After I return to the divine capital, I'll mention this matter to Her Majesty, but I don't know if Her Majesty will agree." Xian Jizi cupped his fists and said, "Senior brother thanks junior brother in advance." Li Mu continued, "The imperial court's attitude towards the various sects is the same, and it's not easy to make an exception. I think that if we can show some sincerity, the possibility of Her Majesty agreeing might be greater." Xian Jizi asked, "What sincerity?" Li Mu looked at him and said leisurely, "Her Majesty has just ascended the throne and is short of manpower. If the ancestral court can cooperate with the imperial court and send some elders to be stationed in the imperial court in the capacity of a consecrator, then make a request, wouldn't it be difficult for Her Majesty to refuse?" Li Mu needed to correct the misconception of the upper echelons of the Fulu school that they always liked to freeload when they encountered problems. Freeloading would not last long. Cooperation was a win-win situation. Only with effort would there be returns. Not everyone was like Li Mu, willing to indulge their bad habits. After thinking for a while, Xian Jizi nodded and said, "This is not difficult." Since the two of them had reached an agreement on this issue, the following matters were much simpler. Li Mu was not only a second-generation disciple of the Fulu school, but also an official of the Great Zhou. It was more than suitable for him to be the middleman. Chapter 340. Li Mu wondered if he was born to be busy. Taking advantage of his vacation time, he even facilitated the cooperation between the Fulu school and the court. In the past, although the court had cooperated with the various sects, it was only at a superficial level. For example, the large sects allowed their low-level disciples to be stationed in local government offices to help the local officials govern their areas. The court gave the sects their territories and allowed them to recruit disciples in the vicinity of the power they belonged to, and so on. This kind of cooperation on a deeper level rarely happened in the past. The reason was naturally the distrust between the two sides. The power and strength of these sects were too strong enough to threaten the rule of the court. Moreover, the court had absolute control over the 36 counties in name. The 4 sects and 6 schools' activities in the secular world were greatly restricted. Because of this suspicion and distrust, the Great Zhou court had never had an official from the 4 sects and 6 schools. Even a minor official was required to not have a sect background, and the high-level positions of these sects were not held by officials of the court. Li Mu was probably the first person to hold both a high position in the court and a high level of a sect. With him as the middleman, it was most appropriate. Li Mu did not tell the Empress anything else about the Fulu school. He only said that he intended to facilitate the cooperation between the Fulu school and the court. The court would pay attention to the talented disciples of the Fulu school, and the Fulu school would also send powerful elders as guests of the court. The Empress was currently lacking manpower, and this was something to be happy about. However, Li Mu did not hear the Empress's happiness. She was like a salted fish as an empress. She did not have the slightest bit of initiative, nor was she active in doing things. Her most active activity was to run to Li Mu's house to freeload food, and to help Li Mu with the spirit snail to check on him. More than 100 times in 3 days. Not to mention a superior, even a girlfriend rarely did this. Fortunately, Lu Hanyan was different from her. Otherwise, Li Mu would probably go crazy. In the Spirit Snail, the Empress said calmly, "You can decide on this matter." This could also be considered a national policy. From a certain point of view, it was Li Mu's duty as the censor of the palace secretariat. However, he still had to ask for the Empress's permission, so as to avoid the bad reputation of a favored official causing chaos in the government. Li Mu sighed. The Empress didn't even care about collaborating with Fulu School. He didn't know what she cared about. On the other side, the Empress no longer mentioned this matter. Instead, she asked, "When are you coming back?" Li Mu replied, "I will do it as soon as possible." The voice in the conch was clearly dissatisfied. "You said it would be quick more than a month ago. How quick is it?" Li Mu explained helplessly, "This time, it's really as fast as possible. The shortest is 3 days, the longest is 5 days. After spending a few days with Lu Hanyan, she went into seclusion with Yu Zhenzi." Li Mu could have returned to the fairy's capital now, but the Seven Peaks disciple competition was about to begin. As a second-generation disciple, he needed to attend. The Empress was really too much. She didn't care about the country's affairs and urged him to go back to work so urgently. This also affected Li Mu's enthusiasm. Great Zhou was her great Zhou, and Li Mu was working for her. She couldn't always sit at the top and let Li Mu do all the work. She should at least give him some response. This way, Li Mu would have more motivation to do things. Li Mu put down the spirit conch and heard a buzzing sound coming from outside the courtyard. The Dao Bell was urging him from outside. Li Mu put away the spirit conch and walked out of the door. He said, "Don't rush me. I'm coming, White Cloud Mountain." Today was the day of the ancestral court of Fulu School's Seven Peaks competition. The all-peak competition was held once every 4 years like the Talisman Dao trial. There was only a month's difference in time. In the past, the results of the Talisman Dao trial would be a hot topic among the disciples of the sect. However, this year, after the trial ended, it didn't cause much of a stir. This was because the trial left too many mysteries for the disciples. First of all, the first place of the previous trial would immediately become a core disciple and receive great support from the sect. They could enjoy cultivation resources that ordinary disciples couldn't enjoy. For a long time after the trial ended, the first place of the trial would be the object of envy of all the disciples. However, the identity of this year's first place was still a mystery. It wasn't just the first place. After the trial ended, the first and second place of the trial completely disappeared as if they had evaporated into thin air. Other than that, on the day of the trial, there was a strange phenomenon on Mount Baiyun. No one knew what was going on. However, according to the ancient books, some disciples guessed that when the sage-level Fulu was born, there would be a heavenly tribulation. The strange phenomenon on Mount Baiyun that day was very similar to a heavenly tribulation. As soon as this was said, there were different opinions. Some people said that the sect master drew the sage-level Fulu. Some people said that the strange phenomenon was caused by the sect master's advancement to transcendence. Some people said that the person who drew the sage-level Fulu was the first place of the trial. However, the sect had never explained this, and this matter had never been concluded. Before the grand competition, the disciples of the various peaks had already gathered around the main peak square. This grand competition was related to the honor of the participating disciples, and also related to the resources that each peak could obtain from the sect in the next 4 years. The top 3 disciples of the grand competition would each receive a heaven-level Fulu. The first place of the grand competition would also have the opportunity to become a direct disciple of the sect master and be promoted to a third-generation elder. The top 10 disciples of the grand competition would also receive an earth-level Fulu and the opportunity to receive guidance from the sect master. Therefore, every time the grand competition was held, the disciples of the various peaks would do their best to obtain the highest ranking. This was not only for themselves, but also for the honor of the various peaks. Li Mu originally wanted to return to the divine capital as soon as possible so that the Empress wouldn't nag him all day long. However, Shen Jizi said that he had to participate in this grand competition. He could skip the disciple recruitment ceremony, But as the disciple of the Grand Elder and a second-generation disciple of the Fulu school, he had to show his face in front of the disciples of the ancestral court and the important figures of the Fulu school's branches. For this reason, he even gave Li Mu a Taoist name, Ling Jizi. In the Fulu school, not everyone had a Taoist name. The third-generation and fourth-generation disciples didn't have high cultivation bases, so most of them called themselves by their secular names. Generally, only after they advanced to the Dongxian level would they consider giving themselves a Taoist name. After all, Sect Master Xianjizi and Sect Master Yuzhen sounded more like experts than Sect Master Wang Ergu and Sect Master Chen Erniu. Although Li Mu wasn't used to his new Taoist name, he didn't resist it. As soon as Li Mu landed on the main peak square, Hanja walked over from a certain direction and asked in surprise, "You haven't returned to the divine capital yet?" Li Mu replied, "I'll leave after the grand competition." "You'll participate in the grand competition?" Hanja was stunned for a moment, then a surprised expression appeared on his face. He asked, "You've also joined our Fulu school? Don't tell me you've also taken a sect master as your master?" Li Mu shook his head and said, "No." Hanja breathed a sigh of relief and asked, "Which elder is your master?" Li Mu replied, "Fu Daozi." Hanja touched his head and shook his head. "I've never heard of him. Which peak is he from?" Li Mu replied, "The main peak." Hanja said enviously, "The main peak is good. The main peak is full of core disciples. You can have whatever you want. You don't even need to fight. I told you, with your relationship with Lu, Martial Uncle Lu, you won't do too badly after joining the sect." He looked Li Mu up and down a few times before lowering his head to look at himself. He asked in confusion, "Why is your Taoist robe different from mine?" Hanja's Tao robe had a blue base, while Li Mu's Tao robe was mainly white. In the Fulu school, disciples of different levels wore Tao robes of different colors. For fourth-generation disciples like Hanja, their Tao robes were mainly sky blue. For third-generation disciples, the elders of the peaks, their Tao robes were pale yellow. Only the sect leader and the peak chiefs would wear white Tao robes. Before Li Mu could speak, Hanja suddenly seemed to think of something. He looked at him in surprise and said in shock, Fu Daozi, isn't Fu Daozi the Taoist name of the Grand Supreme Elder who disappeared for a long time? You took the Grand Supreme Elder as your master?" Li Mu did not deny it, which was equivalent to admitting to Hanja's words. Hanja was stunned. Really?" Li Mu replied, "Really?" Hanja grabbed his hair and mumbled, "Let me straighten it out first. You're a second-generation disciple and I'm a fourth-generation disciple. Doesn't that mean I have to call you Grandmaster Martial Uncle?" Li Mu nodded and said, "In theory, yes." Hanja suffered a huge blow. Although he didn't want to compare himself to Li Mu, his former friend had now become his martial granduncle. Li Mu even had to bow to him when he saw him in the sect. This was something that Hanja couldn't accept. However, he quickly realized something and raised his head to look at Li Mu. He asked, "You're my martial granduncle. Doesn't that mean you're Miss Hanyan's martial granduncle and junior sister Li's martial granduncle? Wait, your relationship is too messy. Let me sort it out." After counting with his fingers, he finally figured it out and said, "Junior martial sister Li is no longer a disciple of the Fulu school. But Miss Hanyan is Yu Zhenzi's disciple. You're Yu Zhenzi's junior martial brother, so you're her grandmaster martial uncle. You're your future wife's grandmaster martial uncle. Then what's the seniority of your child? Is he the same generation as me or a generation older than me? Wait a minute, I'm confused again." Before Hanja could figure it out, a bell rang from above, indicating that the competition was about to begin. Hanja glanced at Li Mu, then ran away like a wisp of smoke. Li Mu felt that it would be difficult to find him for a drink in the future. As the bell rang, the disciples of the various peaks had already taken their positions outside the square. Several figures flew out from the Tao Palace of the main peak. Xianjizi and the heads of the various peaks each took a seat. Even Yu Zhenzi, who was in a state of seclusion, came out and sat to the right of Xianjizi. Of the 9 chairs, only the one to the left of Xianjizi was empty. The disciples of the various peaks gathered and began to discuss in low voices. That seat was originally Yuzhen Zi's.